Section 12 of Selections of the History of the Franks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Selections of the History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours, translated by Ernest BREHAUT. Book 7. Here begins the 7th book. 1. Though it is my desire to continue the history which the previous books have left untold, still affection requires me first to tell somewhat concerning the death of the blessed Salvius, who, as is well known, died in this year. Footnote: Salvius died September 10, 584. Chilperic's death, which closes Book 6, occurred in 584. End of footnote. As he himself was wont to relate, he continued for a long time in the secular garb, and with secular judges devoted himself to worldly cases, but yet he never entangled himself in the passions in which the mind of the young is usually involved. And finally, when the odor of the divine breath had touched his inward parts, he left the warfare of the world and sought a monastery. And being even then devoted to godliness, he understood that it was better to be poor with the fear of God than to pursue the gains of the perishing world. In this monastery he continued a long time under the rule established by the Fathers. And when he had reached a more mature strength both of understanding and of life, the abbot who was over the monastery died, and he took up the task of feeding the flock. And whereas he should have shown himself more commonly among his brethren for their correction, after he attained this honor he was more retiring, and so he sought for himself a more secluded cell now in the former. As he himself told, he had changed the skin of his body more than 9 times from scourging himself with too great determination. Then, after receiving the office, while he devoted himself to prayer and reading, contented with this abstinence, he kept considering whether it was better for him to be hidden among the monks, or to take the name of abbot among the people. Why say more? He said farewell to his brethren, and they to him, and was immured. While thus immured, he continued in all abstinence more than before, and in his love of charity he sought, when any stranger came, to bestow his prayers on them, and administer the grace of the blessed bread abundantly, which brought sound health to many who were infirm. And once he lay panting on his bed, worn out by a high fever. And behold, his cell was suddenly brightened by a great light, and quivered. And he lifted his hands to heaven, and breathed out his spirit, while giving thanks. With mingled cries of mourning, the monks and his mother took the dead man's body out of the cell, washed and clothed it, and placed it on a bier, and spent the night in weeping and singing psalms. In the morning, while preparations for the funeral went on, the body began to move on the bier, and behold, his cheeks regained color, and, as if roused from a deep sleep, he stirred, and opened his eyes, and lifted his hands, and said, "Merciful God, why hast thou allowed me to return to this gloomy place of life on earth, since thy mercy in heaven would be better for me than vile life in this world?" His people were wonderstruck, and asked what such a prodigy could mean, but he made no answer to their questions. He rose from the bier, feeling no harm from the painful experience he had suffered, and continued for 3 days without the support of food or drink. On the 3rd day he called the monks and his mother, and said, "Listen, dear ones, and understand that what you look upon in this world is nothing, but it is like the prophet Solomon's song, all is vanity. Happy is the man who can live in the world so as to deserve to see the glory of God in heaven." Having said this, he began to doubt whether to say more or be silent. When he had said no more, he was beset by the entreaties of his brethren to tell what he had seen, and he went on. 4 days ago, when my cell quivered and you saw me lifeless, I was seized by 2 angels and carried up to the high heavens, so that I thought I had under my feet not only this filthy world, but the sun also, and the moon, the clouds, and the stars. Then I was taken through a door brighter than this light, into that dwelling, in which all the pavement was like shining gold and silver, a brightness and a spaciousness beyond description, and such a multitude of both sexes was there, that the length and breadth of the throng could not be seen. A way was made for me through the press by the angels who guided me, and we came to a place which I had already seen from a distance. A cloud hung over it brighter than any light, in which no sun, no moon, or star could be seen, but exceeding all these it gleamed more brightly than the light of nature, and a voice came out of the cloud like a voice of many waters. Then I, a sinner, was humbly greeted by men in priestly and worldly dress, who, my guides told me, were martyrs and confessors whom we worship here with the greatest reverence. I stood where I was bidden, and a very sweet odor enveloped me, so that I was refreshed by this sweetness, and up to the present have wanted no food or drink. And I heard a voice saying, Let him return to the world, since he is necessary to our churches. It was only the voice that was heard, for it could not be seen who spoke. And I threw myself on the pavement and said with loud weeping, Alas, alas, Lord, why didst thou show me this, if I was to be deprived of it? Behold, today thou wilt cast me out from thy face to return to the sinful world, and never be able to return here again. I beseech thee, Lord, not to take thy mercy from me, but permit me to stay here, and not fall thither and perish. And the voice which spoke to me said, Go in peace, for I am your keeper until I bring you back to this place. Then I was left alone by my companions, and departed weeping by the gate by which I had entered and returned here. When he had said this, and all present were wonderstruck, God's saint began to weep and say, Woe is me, who have dared to reveal such a mystery, for the pleasant odor which I brought from the holy place, by which I have been supported the last 3 days without eating or drinking, has gone. My tongue too is covered with grievous sores and swollen, so that it seems to fill the whole of my mouth. And I know that it was not well pleasing to my God to make these secrets known. But thou knowest, Lord, that I did this in simplicity of heart, not in boastfulness. I beg thee, be kind, and do not abandon me according to thy promise. After this he said no more, and took food and drink. Now, as I write this, I am afraid that some reader may not believe it, according to what Sallust the historian says. When you speak of the virtue and fame of good men, each calmly believes what he thinks it easy for himself to do. Beyond that he considers it falsely invented. For I call all-powerful God to witness that I learned from his own lips all that I have told. A long time after, the blessed man was taken from his cell, chosen bishop, and ordained against his will. And when he was, I think, in his 10th year as bishop, the plague grew worse in Albi, and the greatest part of the people had now died, and few of the citizens remained. But the blessed man, like a good shepherd, never consented to leave the place, but he continually urged those who were left to devote themselves to prayer, and to keep watch continually, and to be engaged always in good works and profitable thought, saying, Do this, so that if God wishes you to go from this world, you can enter not into judgment, but into rest. And when by God's revelation, as I suppose, he recognized the time of his calling, he made himself a tomb, and washed his body, and clothed it, and thus always intent upon heaven, he breathed out his blessed Spirit. He was a man of great holiness, and not greedy at all. He never wished to possess gold. If he took it under compulsion, he at once paid it out to the poor. In this time, when Mamalus the patrician took many captives from that city, he followed him, and ransomed them all. And the Lord gave him such favors with that people, that the very men who took the captives made him concessions in the price, and also gave him gifts. And so he restored the captives taken from his country to their former liberty. I have heard many good things about this man, but as I desire to return to the history, I have undertaken to pass them over for the most part. 2. Now when Chilperic had died, and had found the death he had long been looking for, the men of Orleans, united with those of Blois, made an attack on the people of Châteaudun, and defeated them, taking them off their guard. They burned their houses and crops, and whatever they could not carry away conveniently, and they plundered flocks and herds, and carried off all that was not fast. Upon their departure, the men of Châteaudun, with the rest of the men of Chartres, pursued them closely, and treated them in the same way as they were treated, leaving nothing in their houses, or outside their houses, or of their houses. And while they were still abusing one another and raging, the men of Orleans were ready to fight the men of Chartres. The counts intervened, and at a hearing before them peace was made, on condition that on the day when court was to be held, the side which flamed out wrongly against the other should make payment according to justice. And thus the war was ended. 3. Vadast is slain in a quarrel with the Saxon Childeric, who settles for it by a payment to Vadast's son. 4. Fredegunda takes refuge in a church. Childebert gets some of her treasure. 5. Fredegunda invites Guthrum to take Chilperic's kingdom, and become guardian to her son. He goes to Paris. Childebert also approaches the city. 6. When the people of Paris refused to admit Childebert, he sent legates to King Guthrum, saying, I know, most righteous father, that it is not unknown to your goodness how up to the present time the enemy has defrauded us both, so that neither of us could find justice for what was due him. Therefore I humbly beg you now to keep the agreement that was made between us after my father's death. Then King Guthrum said to the legates, O wretches, always faithless, you have no truth in you, and you do not stick to your promises. Behold, you failed in all your promises to me, and entered into a new compact with King Chilperic, to drive me from my kingdom, and divide my cities between you. Here is your compact. Here are your very signatures by which you connived together. With what face do you now ask me to receive my nephew Childebert, whom you wished to make my enemy by your perversity? To which the legates said, If you are so possessed with anger as not to keep your promises to your nephew, at least cease taking what is due to him from Charibert's kingdom. And he replied, Here is the agreement entered into with my brothers, that whoever entered Paris without his brother's consent should lose his part. And Polyactus the martyr, and Hilarius and Martin the confessors, were to be his judges and punishers. After this my brother Sigebert entered, who died by the judgment of God and lost his part. So did Chilperic. Now they lost their parts by their wrong-doings. Therefore, since they have died by the judgment of God in accordance with the curses in the compact, I will subject all Sigebert's kingdom with its treasures to my rule by right of law. Nor will I grant anything to any one from it except of my own free will. Away with you then, you everlasting liars and traitors, and take this word to your king. 7. They departed, but legates came again from Chilperic to the king I have mentioned, demanding Queen Fredegunda, and saying, Give up that murderess who strangled my aunt, and killed my father and uncle, and also slew my cousins with the sword. But he answered, In the court which we hold we decide everything and consider what ought to be done. For he was supporting Fredegunda, and used often to invite her to dinner, promising that he would be her strongest defender. And one day when they were dining together, the queen rose and said farewell, but was detained by the king, who said, Eat something more. But she replied, Pardon me, pray my lord, for according to the custom of women I must rise, because of having conceived. Upon hearing this he was amazed, knowing that it was the 4th month since she had borne a son, but he permitted her to rise. Now the leading men of Chilperic's kingdom, like Answald and the rest, gathered about his son, who, as we have stated, was 4 months old, and was named Clothar. And they extracted oaths in the cities that formerly looked to Chilperic to be faithful to King Guthrum and his nephew Clothar. And King Guthrum, by process of justice, restored all that King Chilperic's followers had wrongfully taken from various sources. And he himself gave much to the churches, and he gave effect to the wills of the dead, which had contained bequests to churches, and had been broken by Chilperic. And he was generous to many, and gave much to the poor. 8. But inasmuch as he had no trust in the men among whom he had come, he guarded himself with armed men, and never went to church or to the other places he took pleasure in visiting, without a strong guard. And so one Lord's day, when the deacon had called for silence among the people for the hearing of the Mass, the king rose and addressed the people. I adjure you, men and women who are present, to think it worth while to keep unbroken faith with me, and not to kill me as you lately did my brothers, and to allow me for 3 years at least to help my nephews, who have become my adopted sons. For it may perchance happen, if I die while they are little, that you will perish at the same time. May the eternal Deity not allow it, since there will be no one of our family strong enough to protect you. When he had said this, all the people poured forth prayers to the Lord for the king. 9. While this was going on, Raguntha, King Chilperic's daughter, arrived at Toulouse with the treasures described above, and seeing she was now near the Gothic boundary, she began to contrive excuses for delay, and her people told her also that she ought to remain there for a time, since they were wearied with the journey, and their clothing was rough, their shoes torn, and the harness and carriages which had been brought on wagons were not yet put together. They ought first to make all these preparations with care, and then set out on the journey, and be received in all elegance by her betrothed, and not to be laughed at by the Goths if they appeared among them in a rough condition. While they were delaying for these reasons, Chilperic's death was reported to Duke Desiderius, and he gathered his brave men and entered Toulouse, and finding the treasures took them from the queen's control, and put them in a certain house sealed up, and under the guard of brave men, and he allowed the queen a scanty living until she should return to the city. 10. Gundevald is proclaimed king. 11. A list of prodigies pointing to Gundevald's death. 12. Tours is forced to become subject to Guthrum. 13. Poitiers also comes under Guthrum's control. 14. Now when court was held, Bishop Egidius, Guthrum Boso, Sigvald, and many others were sent by King Chilperic to King Guthrum. And they went in to him, and the bishop said, Most righteous king, we thank the all-powerful God that he has restored you after many toils to your own land and kingdom. And the king said to him, Yes, it is to the King of kings and Lord of lords, who in his mercy thought it right to accomplish this, that due thanks should be given. For it is certainly not to you, by whose treacherous counsel and perjuries my land was burned over a year ago. You never kept good faith with any man. Your crooked dealing appears everywhere. It is not a bishop, but an enemy of my kingdom that you show yourself to be. At these words the bishop, though enraged, was silent. But one of the legates spoke. Your nephew Chilperic begs you to order the cities which his father held to be given back to him. At this he replied, I told you before that our compacts give them to me, and therefore I refuse to restore them. Another of the legates said, Your nephew asks you to order the sorceress Fredegunda, through whom many kings have been killed, to be surrendered to him, so that he can avenge the death of his father, uncle, and cousins. She shall not be given into his power, said Guthrum, because she has a son who is king. Besides, I do not believe that what you say against her is true. Then Guthrum Boso approached the king as if he were going to make some request. But since it had been certainly reported that he had raised Gundevald up as king, Guthrum spoke before him, and said, You enemy of my country and kingdom, who went a few years ago to the east for the express purpose of bringing Bolamer, so I used to call Gundevald, into my kingdom, you who are always treacherous and never perform what you promise. Guthrum Boso replied, You are lord and king, and sit on a royal throne, and no one ventures to make answer to what you say. Now I say that I am innocent of this charge. And if there be any one in my rank who secretly makes this charge against me, let him come now openly and make it. Then, most righteous king, I will leave it to the judgment of God to decide when he sees us fighting on a level field. At this all were silent, and the king added, All ought to be eager to drive from our territories an adventurer whose father was a miller. And to tell the truth, his father was in charge of the combs and wove wool. And although it is possible for one man to be master of two trades, still one of them answered in ridicule of the king. Therefore, as you say, this man had two fathers at the same time, one a worker in wool, the other a miller. Fie on you, king, to say such an outlandish thing. For it is an unheard of thing that one man should have two fathers at the same time, except in a spiritual sense. Then they laughed without restraint, and another legate said, We bid you good-bye, O king. Although you have refused to restore your nephew's cities, we know that the axe is still safe that was driven into your brothers' heads. It will soon strike yours. Thus they went off in a quarrelsome spirit. Then the king, inflamed at their insults, ordered his men to throw on their heads as they went rotted horse dung, chips, hay, and straw covered with filth, and the stinking refuse from the city. And they were badly fouled, and went off amid unmeasured insult and abuse. 15. While Queen Fredegunda was living at the church at Paris, Leonard, formerly an officer of the household, who then came from Toulouse, went to her and began to tell her of the abuse and insults offered to her daughter, saying, "At your command I went with Queen Raguntha and saw her humiliation, and how she was plundered of her treasures and everything, and I escaped by flight, and have come to report to my mistress what has happened." On hearing this she was enraged, and ordered him despoiled in the very church, and she took away his garments, and the belt which he had as a gift from King Chilperic, and ordered him out of her presence. The cooks and bakers too, and whoever she learned of as returning from this journey, she left beaten, plundered, and maimed. She tried to ruin by wicked accusations to the king Nectar, brother of Bishop Bodagisil, and she said he had taken much from the treasury of the dead king. Moreover, she said he had taken from the storehouses sides of meat, and a great deal of wine, and she requested that he should be bound and thrust into prison darkness. But the king's patience and his brother's help prevented this. She did many foolish things, and did not fear God, in whose church she was taking refuge. She had with her at the time a judge, Audo, who had assisted in many wrongdoings in the time of the king, for together with Momulus, the prefect, he subjected to the state tax many Franks, who in the time of King Sigebert the Elder were free born. After the king's death he was despoiled by them, and stripped, so that he had nothing left except what he could carry away. For they burned his house, and would have taken his life if he had not fled to the church with the queen. 16. Praetextatus returns to the bishopric of Rouen. 17. Promotus had been made bishop of Châteaudun by order of King Sigebert, and had been removed after that king's death on the ground that the town was a parish of Chartres. The judgment had been given against him to the effect that he should perform only the functions of a priest. He now came to the king and begged to receive again his ordination as bishop in the town mentioned. But Papalas, bishop of Chartres, opposed him, and said, "It is my parish," pointing especially to the decision of the bishops. And Promotus could obtain nothing more from the king than permission to take again his own property, which he had within the territory of the town, on which he lived with his mother, who was still living. 18. King Guthrum fears assassination. 19. Fredegunda is ordered to retire to her villa at Ruel. 20. She sends a clerk to assassinate Brunhilda. When he returns without success, she has his feet and hands cut off. 21. After this, when King Guthrum returned to Chalon, and endeavored to inquire into his brother's death, and the queen had put the blame on the chamberlain Eberulf, for she had invited him to reside with her after the king's death, but could not prevail upon him to do so, this enmity accordingly broke out, and the queen said that the king had been killed by him, and that he had taken much from the treasures, and so gone off to Tours. And therefore, if the king wished to avenge his brother's death, he might know that Eberulf was the leader in the matter. Then the king swore to all his nobles that he would destroy not only Eberulf himself, but also all his kinsmen, to the 9th degree, in order that by their death the wicked custom of killing kings might be ended. On learning this, Eberulf fled to the church of St. Martin, whose property he had often seized. Then, upon the pretext of watching him, the men of Orleans and Blois came in turn to keep guard, and at the end of 15 days returned with great booty, taking horses, flocks, and herds, and whatever they could carry off. But the men who took away the blessed Martin's horses got into a quarrel, and pierced one another with lances. 2 who were taking mules went to a house near by and asked for a drink, and when the man said he had none, they raised their lances to attack him. But he drew his sword and thrust them both through, and they fell dead. St. Martin's horses were returned. Such evils were done at that time by the men of Orleans that they cannot be described. 22. While this was going on, Eberroth's property was being granted to different persons. His gold and silver and other valuables that he had with him he offered for sale. What he held in trust was confiscated. The herds of horses, swine, and pack animals were taken. His house within the walls, which he had taken from the possession of the church, and which was full of grain, wine, and sides of meat, and many other things, was completely cleaned out, and nothing but the bare walls remained. Because of this he regarded me with great suspicion, although I was running faithfully on his errands, and he kept promising that if he ever regained the king's favor, he would take vengeance on me for what he had suffered. But God, to whom the secrets of the heart are revealed, knows that I helped him disinterestedly, as far as I could. And although in former times he had laid many traps for me in order to get St. Martin's property, still there was a reason why I should forget them, namely, because I had taken his son from the holy font. But I believe it was the greatest drawback to the unlucky man that he showed no respect to the holy bishop. For he often engaged in violence within the very portico that is close to the saint's feet, and was continually occupied with drunkenness and vanities, and when a priest refused to give him wine, since he was plainly drunk already, he crushed him down on a bench, and beat him with his fists, and with other blows, so that he seemed to be almost dying, and perhaps he would have died if the cupping glass of the physicians had not helped him. Now, because of his fears of the king, he had taken his lodging in the audience chamber of the holy church. And when the priest who kept the door keys had closed the other doors and gone, girls went in with the rest of his attendants by the door of the audience chamber, and looked at the paintings on the walls, and fingered the ornaments of the holy tomb, which was a wicked crime in the eyes of the religious. And when the priest learned of this, he drove nails in the door, and fitted bars within. And after dinner, when he was drunk, he noticed this, and as we were singing in the church on account of the service at nightfall, he entered in a rage, and began to attack me with abuse and curses, reviling me, among other things, because I wished to keep him away from the holy bishop's tomb cover. But I was amazed that such madness should possess the man, and tried to calm him with soothing words. But as I could not overcome his rage by gentle words, I decided to be silent. And finding that I would say nothing, he turned to the priest and overwhelmed him with abuse, for he assailed both him and me with vile language and various insults. But when we saw that he was, so to speak, possessed by a demon, we went out of the church and ended the disgraceful scene and the service at the same time, being especially indignant that he had become so abusive before the very tomb, without respect for the holy bishop. In these days I saw a vision, which I told him in the holy church, saying, I thought that I was celebrating Mass in this holy church, and when the altar with the offerings was now covered with a silk cloth, I suddenly saw King Guthrum entering, and he said in a loud voice, Drag out the enemy of my family, tear the murderer away from God's sacred altar. And when I heard him, I turned to you and said, Wretch, take hold of the altar cloth with which the holy gifts are covered, lest you be cast out of here. And although you laid hold of it, you held it with a loose hand and not manfully. But I stretched out my hands and opposed my breast against the king's breast, saying, Do not cast this man out of the holy church, lest you incur danger to your life, lest the holy bishop destroy you by his power. Do not kill yourself with your own weapon, because if you do this you will lose the present life and the eternal one. But when the king opposed me, you let go the cloth and came behind me. And I was very much annoyed at you. And when you returned to the altar, you took hold of the cloth, but again let go. And while you held it without spirit, and I manfully resisted the king, I woke up in terror, not knowing what the dream meant. Now when I told it to him, he said, "It is a true dream that you just saw, because it strongly agrees with my purpose." And I said to him, "And what is your purpose?" He replied, "I have determined that if the king orders me to be dragged from this place, I will hold to the altar cloth with one hand, and with the other draw my sword, and first kill you, and then as many clerks as I can reach. And after this it would not be a misfortune for me to die, if I first took vengeance on this saint's clerks." I heard this and was amazed, and wondered why it was that the devil spoke by his mouth, for he never had any fear of God. For while he was at liberty, his horses and flocks were let go among the crops and vineyards of the poor. And if they were driven away by the men whose labor they were destroying, these were at once beaten by his men. In this trouble in which he was, he often told how many of the blessed bishop's possessions he had taken unjustly. In fact, the year before he had urged on a certain foolish citizen, and caused him to summon the bailiffs of the church. Then, without regard for justice, he had taken property which the church formerly possessed, under pretence of having bought it, given the man the gold ornament on his belt. Moreover, he acted perversely in many other things to the end of his life, which we shall tell later. 23. In this year Armentarius, a Jew, with one attendant of his own sect and 2 Christians, came to Tours to demand payment of the bonds which Injuriosus, ex-vicar, and Eunomius, ex-count, had given to him on account of the tribute. And calling on the men, he received a promise to pay the sum with interest. And they said to him besides, "If you will come to our house, we will pay what we owe, and honor you with presents also, as is right." He went and was received by Injuriosus, and placed at dinner. And when the feast was over and night came, they arose and passed from one place to another. Then, as they say, the Jews and the 2 Christians also were killed by Injuriosus's men, and thrown into a well which was near the house. Their kinsmen heard what had been done, and came to Tours, and information was given by certain men, and they found the well, and took the bodies out, while Injuriosus vigorously denied that he had been involved in this matter. After this it came to trial, but as he denied it with vigor, as I have said, and they had no means of proving him guilty, it was decided that he should take oath that he was innocent. But they were not satisfied with this, and they set the trial before King Chilperic. However, neither the money nor the bonds of the dead Jew were found. Many said at the time that Medard, the tribute, was involved in this crime, because he too had borrowed money from the Jew. However, Injuriosus went to the trial before King Chilperic, and waited for 3 days until sunset. But as they did not come, and he was not examined on the case by anyone, he returned home. 24. The territory of Portois is devastated, and its people are forced to declare their allegiance to Guthrum a second time. 25. Merovingian, who had been regarded as the chief physician in King Chilperic's household, they attacked most eagerly. And although he had been well plundered already by Duke Gregory, he was a second time stripped bare by these, so that he had no substance left. They took away his horses, gold, silver, and other valuables alike, and subjected him to the control of the church. for his father's service had been to attend to the mills of the church, and his brothers and cousins and other relatives were attached to the kitchens and mills of their masters. 26. Gundevald goes among the southern cities extracting the oath of allegiance. 27. He enters Toulouse and exiles Bishop Magnulf. 28. Guthrum's army marches south from Poitou. 29. Eberulf is slain by Claudius. 30. A legate of Gundevald is captured by Guthrum. 31. Gundevald obtains a piece of the finger bone of the martyr Sergius, hearing that an Oriental king had defeated his enemy by the help of one of Sergius's finger bones. 32. Two legates of Gundevald are taken and tortured. 33. Friendship is re-established between Guthrum and Chilperic. 34. Gundevald takes refuge in Comminges. 35. March of Guthrum's army to Comminges. 36. Guthrum's men outside the wall abuse Gundevald, and he answers with an account of his life. 37. The 15th day of this siege had dawned when Ludegisel began to make ready his engines to destroy the city. Wagons carrying battering rams covered with woven branches and planks under which the army was to move forward to tear down the walls. But when they came near, they were so overwhelmed with stones that all who got near the wall perished. They threw upon them pots of burning pitch and fat, and hurled jars full of stones down on them, and when night ended the contest, the army returned to the camp. Now Gundevald had on his side Cheruf, a very rich and powerful man, with whose storerooms the city was very full, and it was on his substance that they were chiefly supported. And Bladas saw what was being done, and was afraid that Ludegisel would win the victory, and put them to death. So he set fire to the bishop's house, and when the people shut in the city ran to put the fire out, he slipped away and departed. In the morning the army rose again for battle, and they made bundles of rods, as if to fill the deep trench which lay on the east. But here the engine could do no harm, and Sagittarius, the bishop, went frequently around the walls in arms, and from the wall hurled stones with his own hand at the enemy. 38. Finally, when those attacking the city saw that they could accomplish nothing, they sent secret messages to Momulus, saying, "Recognize your lord and finally give up your perversity. What madness possesses you to become a follower of an unknown man? For your wife and your daughters have been captured, and your sons have been already slain. What end are you coming to? What do you expect, except to perish?" He received this message and replied, "Already, as I see, our kingdom has reached its end and its power fails. One thing is left. If I learn that I have security of life, I can relieve you of great trouble." When the messengers left, Bishop Sagittarius, with Momulus, Cheruf, and Watto, hastened to the church, and there they swore to one another that if they should be assured of life, they would give up their friendship for Gundevald, and betray him to the enemy. The messengers returned and promised them security of life, and Momulus said, "Let this be done. I will betray him into your hand, and I will recognize my master the king, and hasten to his presence." Then they promised that if he did this they would receive him to their friendship, and if they could not secure his pardon from the king, they would place him in a church that he might avoid the punishment of death. This they promised with an oath, and then departed. And Momulus went to Gundevald with Bishop Sagittarius and Watto, and said, "You were present and know what oaths of faithfulness we took to you. But now accept wholesome counsel, and go down from this city, and present yourself to your brothers, as you have often desired to do. For we have spoken with these men, and they have told us that the king does not wish to lose your support, because too few remain of your family. But he understood their treachery, and bursting into tears, said, It was at your invitation I came to these Gauls, and of my treasures, comprising a great amount of silver and gold and various articles of value, some have been kept in Avignon, and some have been taken by Guthrum Boso. And next to God's help, I placed all my hope in you, and to you entrusted my counsels, and by your help always wished to reign. Now let your settlement be with God if you have lied to me, for he will judge my cause. To this Momyllus replied, We are not speaking deceitfully to you, and lo, brave men are standing at the gate awaiting your coming. Now lay down my gilded belt that you are wearing, that you may not seem to go forth boastingly, and gird on your sword, and give me mine back. He answered, There is a double meaning in what you say, since you are taking away the things of yours that I have used as a token of affection. But Momyllus swore that no harm should be done to him. Accordingly they went out of the gate, and he was received by Olo, Count of Bourges, and by Boso. And Momyllus returned into the city with his followers, and barred the gate very securely. And when Gundevald saw that he was betrayed into the hands of his enemies, he raised his hands and eyes to heaven, and said, Eternal Judge, true avenger of the innocent, God from whom all justice comes, whom lying displeases, in whom is no craft or wicked cunning, to thee I commend my cause, praying that thou mayest be a swift avenger upon those who have betrayed an innocent man into the hands of his enemies. Having said this, he crossed himself and went off with the men I have mentioned. And when they had gone some distance from the gate, as the whole valley around the city is precipitous, he was given a push by Olo and fell, Olo calling out, There is your Bolomer, who says he is brother and son of a king. And he threw his lance and wished to pierce him, but it was checked by the links of Gundevald's coat of mail, and did him no injury. Then when he rose and attempted to climb the mountain, Boso threw a stone and struck his head, and he fell and died. And the whole throng came and thrust their lances into him, and tied his feet with a rope, and dragged him through all the camp of the armies. And they tore out his hair and beard, and left him unburied in the place where he was killed. The next night the leaders secretly carried off all the treasures they could find in the city, together with the church utensils. And in the morning they opened the gates and admitted the army, and gave over all the common folk inside to the edge of the sword, butchering also the bishops of the Lord with their attendants at the very altars of the churches. And after they had killed all, so that not one remained, they burned the whole city, both churches and other buildings, and left nothing but bare ground. 39. Now Ludigiso, on his return to the camp with Momyllus, Sagittarius, Sharuf, and Wado, sent messengers secretly to the king to ask what he wished to be done with them. And he gave orders to put them to death. But Wado and Sharuf by that time had left their sons as hostages and gone off. When the word about their death had come, and Momyllus heard of it, he put on his armor and went to Ludigiso's hut. And Ludigiso saw him, and said to him, Why do you come thus, as if ready to flee? And he answered, The word that was given is not to be kept, I see, for I know that I am close to death. But Ludigiso replied, I will go out and settle everything. He went out, and immediately by his command the house was surrounded in order that Momyllus might be killed. But he made a long resistance against his assailants, and at last came to the door, and as he stepped out, two with lances struck him on each side, and so he fell and died. On seeing this, the bishop was overwhelmed with fear, and one of the bystanders said to him, "Behold with your own eyes, bishop, what is being done. Cover your head to escape recognition, and make for the woods, and hide for a little time, and when their anger passes you can escape." He took the advice, but while he was trying to get away with his head covered, a certain man drew his sword and cut off his head, hood and all. Then each and all returned home, plundering and killing along the way. In these days Fredegunda sent Chupon to Delus to bring her daughter thence as best he could. Now many said that he was sent in case he found Gundevald alive, to entice him away with many promises and bring him to her. But since Chupon could not do this, he took Regunda and brought her back from that place amid great scorn and contempt. 40. Momulus's treasures, amounting to 252 talents of silver and a great value in gold, are taken. 41. A giant, 2 or 3 feet taller than the tallest men, is taken by King Guthrum. 42. The Count of Bourges attempts to fine St. Martin's men for not taking part in the expedition against Gundevald. 43. Desiderius, Waldo, and Cheruf escape. 44. There was at this time a woman who had a spirit of divination, and won great gain for her owners by prophesying, and she won such favor from them that she was set free and left to her own devices. And if any one suffered from theft or any wrongdoing, she would at once tell where the thief had gone, to whom he had given the property, or what he had done with it. She gathered together gold and silver every day, and went forth in rich clothing, so that she was thought among the people to be something divine. But when this was reported to Agaric, bishop of Verdun, he sent to arrest her. When she was arrested and brought to him, he perceived, according to that which we read in the Acts of the Apostle, that there was in her an unclean spirit of divination. And when he set a formula of exorcism over her, and anointed her head with holy oil, the demon cried out, and revealed to the bishop what it was. But since he could not drive it from the woman, she was allowed to go. And the woman saw that she could not dwell in the place, and she went off to Queen Fredegunda and remained hid. 45. In this year a severe famine oppressed almost all of the Gauls. Many dried and ground into powder grapes, seeds, and oat chaff, and fern roots, and mixed a little flour with it, and made bread. Many cut straw and did the same. Many who had no flour ate different herbs which they gathered, and in consequence swelled up and died. Many too wasted away and died of starvation. At that time the traders plundered the people greatly, selling scarcely a peck of grain or half measure of wine for the third of a piece of gold. They subjected the poor to slavery in return for a little food. 46. Christopher, a trader, is killed by his Saxon slaves, one of whom is caught and executed. 47. Quarrel between two citizens of Tours. Here ends the 7th book. End of section 12. Section 13 of Selections of the History of the Franks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Selections of the History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours, translated by Ernest BREHAUT. Book 8. In Christ's name, here begins Book 8. 1. Now King Guthrum, in the 24th year of his reign, started from Chalon and went to the city of Nevers. For he was going to Paris by invitation, to receive from the holy font of regeneration Chilperic's son, whom they were already calling Clothar. And he left the territory of Nevers and came to the city of Orleans, and at that time appeared much among the citizens. For on receiving invitations he went to their homes, and partook of the repasts offered him. He received many gifts from them, and bestowed many gifts on them in a very generous way. And when he came to the city of Orleans, the day was the festival of the blessed Martin, namely, the 4th of the Nones, of the 5th month, July 4. And a huge throng of people came to meet him with standards and banners, singing praises. And here the Syrian language, there that of the Latins, and again that even of the Jews, sounded together strangely in varied praises, saying, Long live the King! May his reign over the people last unnumbered years. And the Jews, who were to be seen taking part in the praises, said, May all the nations honor you, and bend the knee, and be subject to you. And so it happened that when the king was seated at dinner after Mass, he said, Woe to you, Jewish tribe, wicked, treacherous, and always living by cunning! Here's what they were after, said he, when they cried out their flattering praises today, that all the nations were to honor me as master. They wish me to order their synagogue, long ago torn down by the Christians, to be built at the public cost. But by the Lord's command I will never do it. O King, glorious for wonderful wisdom! He so understood the craft of the heretics that they entirely failed to get from him what they were going to propose later. At the dinner the king said to the bishops who were present, I beg you to give me your blessing tomorrow in my house and bring me salvation by your coming, so that I may be saved when in my humility I receive your words of blessing. When he said this, all thanked him, and as dinner was finished, we rose. 2. In the morning, while the king was visiting the holy places to offer prayer, he came to my lodging. It was the church of Saint Avitus the abbot, whom I mentioned in my book of the miracles. I rose gladly, I admit, to go to meet him, and after giving him my blessing, begged him to accept St. Martin's holy bread at my lodging. He did not refuse, but courteously came in, drank a cup, invited me to the dinner, and went away in good humor. At that time Bertram, Bishop of Bordeaux, and Palladius of Saintes were in great disfavor with the king because of their support of Gundovald, of which we have told above. Moreover, Bishop Palladius had especially offended the king because he had repeatedly deceived him. Now they had recently been under examination before the remaining bishops and the nobles as to why they had supported Gundovald, and why they had foolishly ordained Fustian bishop of Aix at his command. But Bishop Palladius took the blame for the ordination of his metropolitan, Bertram, and took it on his own shoulders, saying, My metropolitan was suffering greatly from sore eyes, and I was plundered, and treated with indignity, and dragged to the place against my will. I could do nothing else than obey one who said he had received complete control of the Gauls. When this was told the king, he was greatly irritated, so that he could scarcely be prevailed upon to invite to the dinner these bishops whom he had previously refused to see. So when Bertram came in, the king asked, Who is he? For it had been a long time since he had seen him. And they said, This is Bertram, Bishop of Bordeaux. And the king said to him, We thank you for keeping faith as you have with your own family. For I would have you know, beloved father, that you are my kinsman on my mother's side, and you should not have brought a plague from abroad upon your own people." When Bertram had been told this and more, the king turned to Palladius and said, "You do not deserve much gratitude either, Bishop Palladius, for you perjured yourself to me 3 times, a hard thing to say of a bishop, sending me information full of treachery. You excused yourself to me by letter, and at the same time you were inviting my brother in other letters. God will judge my cause, since I have always tried to treat you as fathers of the Church, and you have always been treacherous." And he said to the bishop Nicasius and Antidius, "Most holy fathers, tell me what you have done for the advantage of your country or the security of my kingdom." They made no reply, and the king washed his hands, and after receiving a blessing from the bishops, sat at table with a glad countenance and a cheerful behavior, as if he had said nothing about the wrongs done him. 3. Meantime, when the dinner was now half over, the king asked me to request my deacon, who had sung the repository at the mass the day before, to sing. When he had sung, he next asked me to request all the bishops, who at my instance had come prepared, to appoint each a single clerk from his service to sing before the king. And so I made the request at the king's command, and they sang, each to the best of his ability, a psalm before the king. And when the courses were being changed, the king said, "All the silver you see belonged to that perjurer Momulus, but now by the help of God's grace it has been transferred to my ownership. I have already had 15 of his dishes like the larger one you see yonder melted down, and I have kept only this one and one other of 170 pounds. Why keep more than enough for daily use? It is too bad, but I have no other son than Sigebert, and he has enough treasures which his father left him, beside what I have sent to him from the property of this wretch, which was found at Avignon. The rest must be given for the necessities of the poor and the churches." 4. There is only one thing that I ask of you, my lord bishops, namely, to pray God's mercy for my son Sigebert, for he is a man of sense and ability, so that one so cautious and energetic as he could scarcely be found in many years. And if God would deign to grant him to these Gauls, perhaps there would be hope that by him our race, greatly weakened though it is, can rise again. And I have confidence that this will happen through his mercy, because the indications at the boy's birth were of this sort. For it was the holy day of Easter, and my brother Sigebert was standing in the church, and the deacon was walking the procession with the holy book of the Gospels. And a messenger came to the king, and the words of the deacon as he read from the Gospels and of the messenger were the same, saying, "To thee a son has been born." And when they both spoke together, all the people cried out, "Glory to all-powerful God!" Moreover, he was baptized on the holy day of Pentecost, and was made king also on the holy day of the Lord's birth. And so, if your prayers attend him, God willing, he will be able to rule. So the king spoke, and all prayed the Lord in his mercy to keep both kings safe. The king added, "It is true that his mother, Brunhilde, threatens my life, but I have no misgiving on this account, for the Lord who saved me from the hands of my enemies will save me from her plots too." 5. Then he said much against Bishop Theodore, protesting that if he came to the synod he would thrust him off again into exile, and saying, "I know it was for the sake of these people that he caused my brother Chilperic to be killed. In fact, I ought not to be called a man if I cannot avenge his death this year." But I made answer, What killed Chilperic, unless it was his own wickedness and your prayers? For he laid many plots for you contrary to justice, and they brought death to him. And so to speak, it was just this that I saw in a dream when I beheld him with tonsured head, being ordained a bishop apparently, and then I saw him placed on a plain chair hung only with black, and carried along with shining lamps and torches going before him. When I told this, the king said, and I saw another vision which foretold his death. He was brought into my presence loaded with chains by 3 bishops, of whom one was Tetricus, the second Agricola, and the third Nicechius of Lyons. And 2 of them said, Set him free, we entreat you. Give him a beating and let him go. But Bishop Tetricus answered harshly, It shall not be so, for he shall be burned with fire for his crimes. And when they had carried on this discussion for a long time, as if quarreling, I saw at a distance a cauldron set on fire and boiling furiously. Then I wept, and they seized unhappy Chilperic, and broke his limbs, and threw him in the cauldron. And he was immediately so melted and dissolved amid the steam from the water, that no trace of him at all remained. The king told this story, and we wondered at it. And the feast being finished, we rose. 6. The next day the king went hunting. When he returned, I brought into his presence Garachar, Count of Bordeaux, and Bladast, who, as I have told you before, had taken refuge in the church of St. Martin, because they had been followers of Gundevald. I had previously made intercession for them, but had failed. And so at this later time I said, Hear me, powerful king. Behold, I have been sent to you on an embassy by my master. What answer shall I give to him who sent me, when you refuse to give me any answer? And he said in amazement, Who is your master who sent you? I smiled and answered, The blessed Martin. Then he ordered me to bring the men before him, and when they entered his presence he reproached them with many treacheries and perjuries, calling them again and again tricky foxes. But he restored them to his favor, giving back what he had taken from them. 7. When the Lord's day came, the king went to church to hear mass. And the brethren and fellow bishops who were there yielded to Bishop Palladius the honor of celebrating it. When he began to read the prophecy, the king inquired who he was. And when they told him that it was the Bishop Palladius, he was angry at once and said, Is he now to preach the sacred word before me, who has always been faithless to me and perjured? I will leave this church immediately, and will not hear my enemy preach. So saying, he started to leave the church. Then the bishops were troubled by the humiliation of their brother, and said to the king, We saw him present at the feast you gave, and we saw you receive a blessing at his hand. And why does the king despise him now? If we had known that he was hated to you, we would have resorted to another to celebrate Mass. But now, if you permit it, let him continue the ceremony which he has begun. Tomorrow, if you bring any charges against him, let it be judged in accordance with the holy canons. By this time Bishop Palladius had retired to the sacristy in great humiliation. Then the king bade him be recalled, and he finished the ceremony which he had begun. Moreover, when Palladius and Bertram were again summoned to the king's table, they became angry at one another, and reproached one another with many adulteries and fornications, and with a good many perjuries as well. At these matters many laughed, but a number who were keener of perception lamented that the weeds of the devil should so flourish among the bishops of the Lord. And so they left the king's presence, giving bonds and security to appear at the synod on the 10th day before the calends of the 9th month. 8. List of prodigies. 9. Queen Fredegunda, 3 bishops, and 300 nobles swear to Guthrum that the young Clothar is Chilperic's son. 10. Guthrum discovers the bodies of Chilperic's sons, Merovingian and Clovis, and gives them due burial. 11. Guthrum's life is in danger. 12. Bishop Theodore of Marseille is forced to appear before Guthrum. 13. Guthrum sends an embassy to Sigebert. 14. Gregory nearly loses his life in crossing the Rhine, but is saved by relics of St. Martin. 15. We started on the journey and came to the town of Voise, and there were met by Deacon Vulafiliac, and taken to his monastery, where we received a very kind welcome. This monastery is situated on a mountain top, about 8 miles from the town I have mentioned. On this mountain Vulafiliac built a great church, and made it famous for its relics of the blessed Martin and other saints. While staying there, I began to ask him to tell me something of the blessing of his conversion, and how he had entered the clergy, for he was a Lombard by race. But he would not speak of these matters, since he was quite determined to avoid vainglory. But I urged him with terrible oaths, first promising that I would disclose to no one what he told, and I began to ask him to conceal from me none of the matters of which I would ask. After resisting a long time, he was overcome at length by my entreaties and protestations, and told the following tale. When I was a small boy, said he, I heard the name of the blessed Martin, though I did not know yet whether he was a martyr or confessor, or what good he had done in the world, or what region had the merit of receiving his blessed limbs in the tomb. And I was already keeping vigils in his honor, and if any money came into my hands, I would give alms. As I grew older, I was eager to learn, and I was able to write before I knew the order of the written letters, before I could read. Then I joined the abbot Aridius, and was taught by him, and visited the church of St. Martin. Returning with him, he took a little of the dust of the holy tomb for a blessing. This he placed in a little case and hung it on my neck. Coming to his monastery in the territory of Limoges, he took the little case to place it in his oratory, and the dust had increased so much that it not only filled the whole case, but burst out at the joints wherever it could find an exit. In the light of this miracle, my mind was the more on fire to place all my hope in his power. Then I came to the territory of Treves, and on the mountain where you are now, built with my own hands the dwelling you see. I found here an image of Diana, which the unbelieving people worshipped as a god. I also built a column on which I stood in my bare feet with great pain. And when the winter had come as usual, I was so nipped by the icy cold that the power of the cold often caused my toenails to fall off, and frozen moisture hung from my beard like candles. For this country is said to have a very cold winter. And when I asked him urgently what food or drink he had, and how he destroyed the images on the mountain, he said, my food and drink were a little bread and vegetables, and a small quantity of water. And when the multitude began to flock to me from the neighboring villages, I preached always that Diana was nothing, that her images and the worship which they thought it well to observe were nothing, and that the songs which they sang at their cups and wild debauches were disgraceful. But it was right to offer the sacrifice of praise to all-powerful God, who made heaven and earth. I often prayed that the Lord would deign to hurl down the image and free the people from this error. And the Lord's mercy turned the rustic mind to listen to my words and to follow the Lord, abandoning their idols. Then I gathered some of them together, so that by their help I could hurl down the huge image which I could not budge with my own strength, for I had already broken the rest of the small images, which was an easier task. When many had gathered at this statue of Diana, ropes were fastened, and they began to pull, but their toil could accomplish nothing. Then I hastened to the church and threw myself on the ground, and weeping, begged the divine mercy that the power of God should destroy that which human energy could not overturn. After praying, I went out to the workmen and took hold of the rope, and as soon as I began to pull, at once the image fell to the ground, where I broke it with iron hammers and reduced it to dust. But at this very hour, when I was going to take food, my whole body was so covered with malignant pimples from sole to crown that no space could be found that a single finger might touch. I went alone into the church and stripped myself before the holy altar. Now I had there a jar full of oil, which I had brought from St. Martin's church. With this I oiled all my body with my own hands, and soon lay down to sleep. I awoke about midnight, and rose to perform the service, and found my whole body cured, as if no sore had appeared on me. And I perceived that these sores were sent not otherwise than by the hate of the enemy. And inasmuch as he enviously seeks to injure those who seek God, the bishops, who should have urged me the more to continue wisely the work I had begun, came and said, "This way which you follow is not the right one, and a base-born man like you cannot be compared with Simon of Antioch, who lived on a column. Moreover, the situation of the place does not allow you to endure the hardship. Come down rather and dwell with the brethren you have gathered." At their words I came down, since not to obey the bishops is called a crime, and I walked and ate with them. And one day the bishops summoned me to a village at a distance, and sent workmen with crossbars and hammers and axes, and destroyed the column I was accustomed to stand on. I returned the next day and found it all gone. I wept bitterly, but could not build again what they had torn down, for fear of being called disobedient to the bishop's orders. And since then I am content to dwell with the brothers, just as I do now. 16. And when I asked him to tell somewhat of the miracles which the blessed Martin worked in that place, he related the following. The son of a certain Frank of the highest rank among his people was deaf and dumb. He was brought by his kinsmen to this church, and I had him sleep on the couch in the holy temple with my deacon and another attendant. And by day he devoted himself to prayer, and at night he slept in the church, as I have said. And when God pitied him, the blessed Martin appeared to me in a vision, saying, "Send the lamb out of the church, for he is now cured." In the morning I was thinking what this dream meant, when the boy came to me and spoke and began to thank God, and turning to me said, "I thank all-powerful God who has restored to me speech and hearing." After this he was cured and returned home. 17. Peculiar appearances in the heavens, from which Gregory expected that some plague would be sent upon them from the heavens. 18. Childebert's invasion of Italy, and the appointment of several dukes and counts. 19. The abbot Dugulfus is taken in adultery. 20. A synod meets at Macon. 21. Childebert hears a charge of grave robbery against Guthrum Boso. 22. Various items of the year 585. 23 through 25. Prodigies. 26. Eberulf, former Duke of Tours and Poitou, loses his property. 27. Desiderius is restored to favor from Guthrum. 28. Relations with the Spanish king. 29. The plot to assassinate Chilperic and its failure. 30. Guthrum sends 2 armies to attack Septimania. They plunder his own territories and turn back without success. 31. Quarrel between Fredegunda and Praetextatus, Bishop of Rouen. 32. Dispute about vineyards between one of Fredegunda's officials and Dumnola. 33. Now there was in these days in the city of Paris a woman who said to the inhabitants, O flee from the city, and know that it must be burned with fire. And when she was ridiculed by many for saying this on the evidence of lots and because of some idle dream, or at the urging of a midday demon, she replied, It is not as you say, for I say truly that I saw in a vision a man all illumined coming from the church of St. Vincent, holding a torch in his hand, and setting fire to the houses of the merchants one after another. Then the 3rd night after the woman made this prophecy, at twilight a certain citizen took a light and went into the storehouse, and took oil and other necessary things, and went out, leaving the light close by the cask of oil. This was the house next the gate, which is towards the south. From this light the house caught fire and burned, and from it others began to catch. Then the fire threatened the prisoners. But the blessed Germanus appeared to them, and broke the posts and chains by which they were bound, and opened the prison door, and allowed all the prisoners to go safe. They went forth and took refuge in the church of St. Vincent, in which is the blessed bishop's tomb. Now when the flame was carried hither and thither through the whole city by the high wind, and the fire had the complete mastery, it began to approach another gate, where there was an oratory of the blessed Martin, which had been placed there because he had there cured a case of leprosy with a kiss. The man who had built it of interwoven branches, trusting in God and confident of the blessed Martin's power, took refuge within its walls with his property, saying, I believe and have faith that he who has so often mastered fire, and at this place by a kiss made a leper's skin clean, will keep the fire from here. When the fire came near, the great masses of flame swept along, but when they touched the wall of the oratory, they were extinguished at once. But the people kept calling to the man and woman, Run if you wish to save yourselves, for a mass of fire is rushing on you. See, ashes and coals are falling around you like a heavy rain. Leave the oratory, or you will be burned in the fire. But they kept on praying, and were never moved by these words. And the woman, who was armed with the strongest faith in the power of the blessed bishop, never moved from the window through which the flames sometimes entered. And so great was the power of the blessed bishop, that he not only saved this oratory together with his follower's house, but he did not permit the flames to injure the other houses which were around. There the fire ceased, which had broken out on one side of the bridge, and on the other side it burned all so completely that only the river stopped it. However, the churches, with the houses attached to them, were not burned. It was said that this city had been, as it were, consecrated in ancient times, so that not only fire could not prevail there, but snakes and mice could not appear. But lately, when a channel under the bridge had been cleaned, and the mud which filled it had been taken out, they found a snake and a mouse of bronze. They were removed, and after that mice without number and snakes appeared, and fires began to take place. 34. Inasmuch as the prince of darkness has 1,000 arts of doing injury, I will relate what lately happened to recluses vowed to God. Venoc, a Breton, who had become a priest, as we have told in another book, was so given up to abstinence that he wore only garments made of skins, and ate wild herbs in a raw state, and merely touched the wine to his lips, so that one would think he was kissing it rather than drinking. But as the devout in their generosity often gave him vessels of this liquor, sad to say, he learned to drink immoderately, and to be so given up to it as to be generally seen drunk. And so, as his drunkenness grew worse, and time went on, he was seized by a demon, and so violently harassed that he would seize a knife of any kind of weapon or stone or club that he could lay hands on, and run after men in an insane rage. And it became necessary to bind him in chains and imprison him in a cell. After raging under this punishment for 2 years, he died. There was also Ampholius of Bordeaux. When a boy of 12 years old, it is said, the servant of a merchant, he asked to be allowed to become a recluse. His master opposed him a long time, thinking he would grow lukewarm, and that at his age he could not attain to what he wished. But he was at length overcome by his servant's entreaties, and permitted him to fulfill his desire. Now there was an old crypt, vaulted and very finely built, and in the corner of it was a little cell, built of squared stones, in which there was hardly room for one man standing. The boy entered this cell, and remained in it 8 years or more, satisfied with very little food and drink, and devoting himself to watching and praying. After this he was seized with a great fear, and began to shout that he was being tortured internally. So it happened, by the aid, as I suppose, of the devil's soldiers, that he tore away the stones that shut him in, dashed the wall to the ground, and cried, wringing his hands, that the saints of God were causing him frightful torture. And when he had continued in this madness for a long time, and often mentioned the name of Saint Martin, and said he caused a more torture than the other saints, he was brought to Tours. But the evil spirit, because, I suppose, of the virtue and greatness of the saint, did not tear the man. He remained at Tours for the space of a year, and as he suffered no more, he returned. But later on he suffered from the trouble that he had been free from here. 35. An embassy from Spain to King Guthrum. 36. By order of King Chilperic, Magnavold was killed in his presence, for reasons not given, in the following manner. The king was staying in his palace in the city of Metz, and was attending a sport in which an animal was surrounded by a pack of dogs, and worried. When Magnavold was summoned, he came, and not knowing what was to happen, he began to look at the animal and laugh heartily with the rest. But a man who had received his orders, seeing him intent on the spectacle, raised his axe and dashed it against his head. He fell and died, and was thrown out by the window, and buried by his own people. His property was taken at once, as much as was found, and carried to the public treasury. Certain persons said that it was because he had beaten his wife to death, after his brother died and had married his brother's wife, that he was killed. 37. Birth of a son to Chilperic. 38. Spanish expedition into Gaul. 39. Death of several bishops. 40. There was in the city of Tours a certain Pelagius, who was practised in every villainy, and was not afraid of any judge, because he had under his control the keepers of the horses belonging to the fisc. Because of this, he never ceased either on land or on the rivers to thieve, dispossess, plunder, murder, and commit every sort of crime. I often sent for him, and both by threats and by gentle words tried to make him desist from his wickedness, but it was hatred rather than any reward of justice I got from him, according to Solomon's proverb, "Reprove not a fool, lest he hate thee." The wretch so hated me that he often plundered and beat and left half dead the men of the Holy Church, and was always looking for pretexts to harm the cathedral or the church of St. Martin. And so it happened that once, when our men were coming and bringing sea urchins in vessels, he beat them, and trampled on them, and took their vessels. When I learned of this, I excommunicated him, not to avenge my wrong, but to correct him more easily of this insanity. But he chose 12 men, and came to clear himself of this crime of perjury. Though I was unwilling to receive any oath, I was compelled by him and my fellow citizens, and so I sent the rest away and received his oath only, and ordered that he be taken back into communion. It was then the 1st month. When the 5th month came, when the meadows are usually cut, he entered a meadow adjoining his own that belonged to the monks. But as soon as he put sickle to it, he was seized with fever and died on the 3rd day. He had had a tomb made for him in St. Martin's Church in the village of Condes, but when it was uncovered, his people found it broken to bits. He was afterwards buried in the portico of the church. The vessels for which he had perjured himself were brought by the storekeeper after his death. Here the power of the Blessed Mary is evident, in whose church the wretch had taken a false oath. 41. Fredegunda is accused of the killing of Praetextatus. 42. Bepolinus leaves Fredegunda, and is made a duke by Guthrum. 43. Palladius, bishop of Saintes, is forced to appear before Guthrum. 44. Fredegunda attempts to have Guthrum assassinated. 45. Death of Duke Desiderius. 46. Richard succeeds Lieveguld of Spain. Here ends the 8th book. End of section 13.
Section 14 of Selections of the History of the Franks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by btuten. Selections of the History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours, translated by Ernest BREHAUT. Book 9. In Christ's name, here begins Book 9 in the 12th year of King Chilperic. 1. Recount, the new king of Spain, sends legates to Guthrum and Chilperic. They are not received by Guthrum. 2. Death of Radegunda. 3. Meanwhile, the festival of St. Marcellus came, which is celebrated in the 7th month in the city of Chalons, and King Guthrum was present. When the ceremony was over and he had approached the holy altar for the communion, a certain man came as if to say something. And as he hastened to the king, a knife fell from his hand. He was seized at once, and they found another knife unsheathed in his hand. He was immediately led from the holy church and put in fetters and subjected to torture. And he confessed that he had been sent to kill the king, saying, "This was the purpose of the man who sent me." Since the king knew that the hatred of many men was united on him, and he feared that he would be stabbed, he had given orders to his men to guard him well, and no opportunity could be found to get at him with swords unless he was attacked in the church, where he was known to stand without care or fear. Now the men who had been named were seized, and many were executed, but he let this man go alive, though severely beaten, because he thought it a crime that a man should be led out of church and beheaded. 4. A second son, Theodoric, is born to Chilperic. 5. Prodigies. Among others, a village with cottages and men disappeared suddenly. 6. There was in that year in the city of Tours a man named Desiderius who claimed to be great and said he could do many miracles. He boasted, too, that messengers were kept busy going to and fro between him and the apostles Peter and Paul. And as I was not at home, the common folk thronged to him, bringing the blind and lame. But he did not attempt to cure them by holiness, but to fool them with the delusion of necromancy. for he ordered paralytics and other cripples to be vigorously stretched as if he were going to cure by taking pains those whose limbs he could not straighten by the blessing of the divine virtue. And so his attendants would lay hold of a man's hands and others his feet, and pull in opposite directions, so that one would think their sinews would be broken, and when they were not cured they would be sent off half dead. And the result was that many died under this torture. And the wretch was so presumptuous that he said he was blessed Martin the Younger, and put himself on a par with the apostles. And it is no wonder that he compared himself with the apostles when that author of wickedness from which such things proceed is going to assert toward the end of the world that he is Christ. Now it was known from the following fact that he was versed in the wicked art of necromancy, as we have said above, because, as they say who observed him, when anyone said any evil of him far away and secretly, he would rebuke them publicly and say, "You said so-and-so about me, and it was not right to say such things of a holy man like me." Now how else could he have learned of it except that demons were his messengers? He wore a hood and a goat's hair shirt, and in public he was abstemious in eating and drinking. But in secret, when he had come to his lodgings, he would stuff his mouth so that his servant could not carry food to him as fast as he asked for it. But his trickery was exposed and stopped by our people, and he was cast out from the territory of the city. We did not know then where he went, but he said he was a citizen of Bordeaux. Now 7 years before there had been another great impostor who deceived many by his tricks. He wore a sleeveless shirt, and over it a robe of fine stuff, and carried a cross from which hung little bottles which contained, as he said, holy oil. He said that he came from the Spains, and was bringing relics of the blessed martyrs Vincent the Deacon and Felix. He arrived at Tours at the church of St. Martin in the evening when we were sitting at dinner, and sent an order saying, "Let them come to see the holy relics." As the hour was late, I replied, "Let the blessed relics rest on the altar, and we will go to see them in the morning." But he arose at the first break of day, and without waiting for me came with his cross and appeared in my cell. I was amazed and wondered at his hardihood, and asked what this meant. He answered in a proud and haughty voice, "You should have given me a better welcome. I'll carry this to the ears of King Chilperic. He will avenge this contemptuous treatment of me." He paid no more attention to me, but went into the oratory and said a verse, then a second and a third, began the prayer and finished it all by himself, then took up his cross again and went off. He had a rude style of speech, and was free with disgusting and obscene terms, and not a sensible word came from him. He went on to Paris. In those days the public prayers were being held that are usually held before the holy day of the Lord's Ascension. And as Bishop Ragnamode was walking in procession with his people and making the round of the holy places, this person came with his cross, and appearing among the people with his unusual clothing, he gathered the prostitutes and women of the lower class and formed a band of his own, and made an attempt to walk in procession to the holy places with his multitude. The bishop saw this and sent his archdeacon to say, "If you have relics of the saints to show, place them for a little in the church, and celebrate the holy days with us, and when the rites are finished you shall go on your way." But he paid little attention to what the archdeacon said, but began to abuse and revile the bishop. The bishop saw that he was an impostor, and ordered him shut up in a cell. And examining all he had, he found a great bag full of roots of different herbs, and also there were moles' teeth, the bones of mice, the claws and fat of bears. He knew that these were the means of sorcery, and ordered them all thrown in the river. He took his cross away, and ordered him to be driven from the territory of Paris. But he made himself a second cross, and began to do what he had done before, but was captured and put in chains by the archdeacon, and kept in custody. In those days I had come to Paris, and had my lodging at the church of the blessed martyr Julian. The following night the wretch broke out of prison, and hastened to St. Julian's church just mentioned, wearing the chains with which he was bound, and fell on the pavement where I had been accustomed to stand, and overwhelmed with drowsiness and wine, he fell asleep. Unaware of this, I rose at midnight to return thanks to God, and found him sleeping. And such a stench came from him that the stench surpassed the stenches of all sewers and privies. I was unable to go into the church because of the stench. And one of the clergy came holding his nose, and tried to wake him, but could not, for the wretch was so intoxicated. Then 4 of the clergy came and lifted him and threw him into one corner of the church. And they brought water and washed the pavement and scattered sweet-smelling herbs on it, and so I went in to offer the regular prayers. But he could not be wakened, even when we sang the psalms, until with the coming of day the sun's torch climbed higher. Then I surrendered him to the bishop with a request for his pardon. When the bishops assembled at Paris, I told this at dinner, and bade him be brought to receive correction. And when he stood by, Emilius, bishop of Tarbes, looked at him and recognized him as his slave who had run away. He secured his pardon and so took him back to his native place. There are many who practice these impostures and continually lead the common people into error. It is of these, I think, that the Lord says in the Gospel that in the latest times false Christs and false prophets shall arise, who shall do signs and wonders, and lead the very elect into error. Let this suffice for this subject. Let us rather return to our task. 7. Ennodius, Duke of Tours and Poitiers, is removed from office. The Gascons make an inroad on Frankish territory, and also the Goths. 8. Childebert desires to punish Guntram Boso for the insults he had offered to Brunhilde during Childebert's minority. 9. Raushingus, Ursio, and Bertefrid, enemies of Brunhilde, plot Childebert's death. Raushingus is trapped and brutally killed. Ursio and Bertefrid take refuge in a stronghold. 10. While this was going on, King Guntram sent a second time to his nephew Childebert, saying, "Let there be no delay. Come that I may see you, for it is surely necessary for your own life as well as for the public welfare that we see one another." Hearing this, he took his mother, sister, and wife, and hastened to meet his uncle. Bishop Magneric of the city of Trèves was present also, and Guntram Boso came, whom Bishop Agaric of Verdun had received in custody. But the bishop who had pledged his faith for him was not present, because the agreement was that he should appear before the king without any defender, so if the king decided that he must die, he was not to be begged off by the bishop, and if the king granted him life, he would go free. Now the kings met, and he was judged guilty on various grounds, and was ordered to be put to death. When he learned it, he flew to Magneric's lodging, and shutting the doors and sending the clerks and attendants away, he said, "Most blessed bishop, I know that you have great honor with the kings, and now I flee to you to be rescued. Behold, the executioners are at the door, whence you may plainly know that if you do not save me, I shall kill you and go outside and die. Let me tell you plainly that either one death overtakes us, or an equal life shall protect us. O holy bishop, I know that you share with the king the place of father to his son, and I am sure that whatever you ask you will obtain from him. He will not be able to deny your holiness anything you demand. Therefore either obtain my pardon, or we shall die together." He said this with his sword unsheathed. The bishop was alarmed at what he heard, and said, "And how can I do it if I am kept here by you? Let me go beg the king's mercy, and perhaps he will pity you." But he replied, "By no means, but send abbots and men who you trust to carry the message I proposed." However, these matters were not reported as they were to the king, but they said that he was being protected by the bishop. And so the king was angry and said, "If the bishop refuses to come out, let him die together with that doer of wickedness." The bishop, when he was told this, sent messengers to the king. And when they had told their story, King Guntram said, "Set fire to the house, and if the bishop cannot come out, let them be burned together." The clerks, on hearing this, burst open the door by force and got the bishop out. Then when the wretch saw that he was hemmed in by great flames on every side, he approached the door with his sword. But as soon as he left the threshold and set foot outside, at once one of the people threw a lance and struck his forehead. He was confused by this stroke and lost his head, and tried to throw his sword, but he was wounded by the bystanders with such a multitude of lances that with the head sticking in his body and the shaft supporting him, he was unable to fall to the earth. A few who were with him were killed and exposed on the field at the same time. And permission to bury them was obtained from the princes only with difficulty. This man was faithless, headlong in avarice, greedy for other men's property beyond limit, swearing to all and fulfilling his promises to none. His wife and sons were sent into exile and his property confiscated. A great quantity of gold and silver and of valuables of different sorts was found in his stores. Moreover, what he had concealed underground from a consciousness of wrongdoing did not remain hidden. He often made use of soothsayers and lots, desiring to learn the future from them, but was always deceived. 11. Guthrum and Childebert settle their differences amicably. 12. Ursio and Bertafrid are dislodged from their stronghold and slain. 13. Bado is allowed to go free. Dysentery is severe in Metz. Wiliulf's wife marries a third time. 14. Bishop Aegidius of Reims makes his peace with Childebert. 15. Now at that time, in Spain, King Ricared was influenced by the divine mercy and summoned the bishops of his religion and said to them, "Why are quarrels continually going on between you and the bishops who call themselves Catholic? And when they do many miracles by their faith, why can you do nothing of the sort? Therefore, I beg you, let us meet with them and examine the beliefs of both sides and find out what is true, and then either let them take our plan and believe what you say, or else you recognize their truth and believe what they preach." This was done, and the bishops of both sides gathered, and the heretics expounded the doctrines that I have often described them as abdicating. Likewise, the bishops of our religion made the replies by which, as I have pointed out in the previous books, the heretics have been often defeated. And above all, the king said that no miraculous cure of the infirm had been done by the bishops of the heretics, and when he recalled to mind how in his father's time the bishop who boasted that he could restore sight to the blind by his faith, which was not the true one, had touched a blind man and thus condemned him to perpetual blindness and had come off in confusion. I have told this story more fully in the Book of the Miracles. He summoned God's bishops to him separately, and by questioning them he learned that it was one God that was worshipped with distinction of three persons, namely the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and the Son was not inferior to the Father nor the Holy Ghost, nor the Holy Ghost inferior to the Father nor the Son, but they were equal and alike all-powerful, and in this Trinity they confessed the true God. Then Ricared perceived the truth, and ending the argument, he placed himself under the Catholic law, and receiving the sign of the Blessed Cross together with baptism, he believed in Jesus Christ, Son of God, equal to the Father and the Holy Ghost, reigning for ages of ages. Amen. Then he sent messengers to the province of Narbonne to tell what he had done, and bring the people to a like belief. The bishop of the Arian sect there at the time was Athelochus, who caused such trouble to God's churches by his vain doctrines and false interpretations of the scriptures that he was believed to be the very Arius who, as the historian Eusebius relates, lost his entrails in a privy. But when he did not allow the people of his sect to believe these things, and only a few flattered him by agreeing with him, he was transported with spite, and went to his cell and laid his head on the bed and breathed out his worthless soul. And thus the heretics in the province confessed the inseparable Trinity and departed from error. 16. King Ricared sends an embassy to Guthrum and Childebert. It is not received by Guthrum. 17. An unusually cold spring. 18. The Bretons ravage the territory of Nantes. 19. The feud among the citizens of Tours, which, as we have stated above, was ended, burst out again with renewed fury. After slaying Cramson's kinsman Sicard had become very friendly with him, and they loved one another so dearly that they often ate together and slept together in one bed. Once Cramson made ready a dinner towards night and invited Sicard. He came and they sat down together to dinner. And Sicard became drunk with wine and made many boasts to Cramson, and he is reported to have said at last, "Dearest brother, you owe me great gratitude for killing your kinsmen, since you got payment for them, and you have much gold and silver in your house. And if that payment had not given you a start, you would now be naked and in need." But Cramson heard Sicard's word with a bitter heart, and said within himself, "Unless I avenge my kinsman's death, I ought to lose the name of man and be called a weak woman." And at once he extinguished the lights and plunged his dagger into Sicard's head. Sicard made a little cry and immediately fell and died. The servants who had come with him rushed away. Cramson stripped the garments from his lifeless body and hung it on a picket of the fence, and mounted his horse and went to the king. He entered the church and threw himself at the king's feet and said, I beg for my life, O glorious king, because I have killed men who slew my kinsmen secretly and plundered all their property. But when the case was gone into in detail, Queen Brunhilda was displeased that Sigebert, who was under her protection, had been killed in such a way, and she became angry at Cramson. When he saw that she was against him, he went to Bouge, a village in the territory of Bouge where his kinsman lived, because it was in Guthrum's kingdom. And Tranquilla, Sigebert's wife, left her sons and her husband's property in Tours and Poitiers and went to her kinsman at Pont-sur-Seine and there married again. Sigebert was 20 years old when he died. He was in his lifetime a fickle, drunken, murderous person who offered insults to many when he was drunk. Later, Cramson returned to the king, and it was decided that he must prove that Sigebert had killed his kinsman. This he did. But since Queen Brunhilda had placed Sigebert under her protection, as we have said, she ordered Cramson's property to be confiscated. But later it was returned by the court official Flavian. In addition, he went to Agen and got a letter from Flavian directing that no one should touch him. Flavian had received his property from the queen. 20. In that year, which was also the 13th of King Childebert, I went to visit him at the city of Metz, and received orders to go on an embassy to King Guthrum. I found him at Chalons, and said, O famous king, your glorious nephew Childebert sends you many greetings, and offers endless thanks to your goodness, because he is continually reminded by you to do the things that please God, and are acceptable to you, and of advantage to the people. As regards the matters of which you spoke together, he promises to fulfill everything, and engages not to break any of the agreements which are made in writing between you. And the king said to this, I do not offer him like thanks, because his promises to me are being broken. My part of Senlis is not surrendered. The men whom I wish to go for my good, since they are my enemies, they have not let go. And in what sense do you mean that my sweet nephew does not wish to break any of his written agreements? To this I answered, he wishes to do nothing contrary to those agreements, but promises to fulfill them all, so that if you wish to send men to divide Senlis, there need be no delay, for you shall receive your own at once. And as to the men you mention, let their names be given in writing, and all that is promised shall be fulfilled. We spoke of these matters, and the king ordered the agreement itself to be read over again in the presence of the bystanders. Copy of the agreement. When the most excellent lords, Kings Guthrum and Childebert, and the most glorious Lady Queen Brunhilda met lovingly in Christ's name at Andelot to arrange with full counsel whatever might in any way cause a quarrel among them, it was affectionately settled, resolved upon and agreed between them that by the mediation of the bishops and chief men and the help of God, that as long as all-powerful God wished them to live in the present world, they ought to keep faith and affection pure and undefiled for each other. In the same way, since Lord Guthrum, in accordance with the agreement which he had entered into with Lord Sigebert of good memory, claimed that the whole share which Sigebert had received from Charibert's kingdom belonged entirely to him, and since the party of Lord Childebert wished to claim from all what his father had possessed, it is definitely and deliberately agreed between them that the third of the city of Paris, with its territory and people, which had gone to Lord Sigebert from Charibert's kingdom by written agreement, with the castles of Châteaudun and Vendôme, and whatever the said king received of the district of Etampes and the territory of Chartres in that direction, with their lands and people, were to remain perpetually under the authority and rule of Lord Guthrum, with that which he held before from Charibert's kingdom while Lord Sigebert was alive. In like manner, King Childebert asserts his right from the present to mow and to 2/3 of Senlis, Tours, Poitiers, Avranches, Aire, Saint-Lizier, Bayonne, and Albi with their territories. The condition being observed that he, of those kings whom the Lord wills to survive, shall have a perpetual right to the whole kingdom of him who goes from the light of the present world without children, and by God's aid shall leave it to his descendants. It is especially agreed upon to be in every way inviolably observed that whatever the Lord King Guthrum has given, or by God's favor shall give, to his daughter Clotilde in goods and men, both cities, lands, and revenues, shall remain under her ownership and control. And if she wishes of her own free will to dispose of lands belonging to the fisc, or valuable articles or money, or to bestow them on anyone, let it be kept with a good title forever, and not be taken from anyone at any time. And let her be under the protection and defense of Lord Chilperic, since she ought to possess in all honor and security everything that he finds her in possession of at her father's death. Likewise the Lord King Guntram promises that if in the uncertainty of human life Lord Chilperic should happen to pass from the light while he is living, may the divine goodness not allow it, and Guntram does not wish to see it, he will receive under his protection and guardianship like a good father Childebert's sons, Theodebert and Theodoric, and any others that God wishes to give him, so that they shall possess their father's kingdom in all security. And he will receive under his protection with a spiritual love Lord Childebert's mother, Queen Brunhilde, and her daughter Clodisand, sister of King Childebert, while she is in the country of the Franks, and his queen Philuba like a good sister and daughters, and they shall possess all their property in all honor and dignity with peace and security, namely, cities, lands, revenues, and all rights, and every kind of property, both what they actually possess at the present time and what they are able justly to acquire in the future by Christ's aid. And if they wish to dispose of any of the lands of the fisc or articles or money of their own free will, or to present them to anyone, let it be kept with a good title forever, and let their will in this respect not be disregarded by anyone at any time. And as to the cities, namely Bordeaux, Limoges, Cahors, Lascar, and Ciotat, which it is well known that Galsuntha, Lady Brunhilde's sister, acquired as dowry or Morgengabe, that is, mourning gift, when she came into Francia, and which Lady Brunhilde is known to have acquired by the decision of the glorious Lord King Guntram and of the Franks when Chilperic and King Sigebert were still alive, it is agreed that the Lady Brunhilde shall have as her property from today the city of Cahors with its lands and all its people, but the other cities named, Lord Guntram shall hold while he lives, on condition that after his death they shall pass by God's favor with every security under the control of the Lady Brunhilde and her heirs. But while Lord Guntram lives, they shall not at any time or on any pretext be claimed by Lady Brunhilde or her son King Childebert or his sons. In the same way it is agreed that Lord Childebert shall hold Senlis in entirety, and as far as the third therein, due to Lord Guntram, is concerned, he shall be compensated by the third belonging to Lord Childebert, which is in Resson. Likewise it is agreed that according to the agreements entered into between Lord Guntram and Lord Sigebert of blessed memory, the Ludis who originally took oath to Lord Guntram after the death of Lord Clothar, if afterwards they are proved to have gone to the other side, shall be removed from the places where they are dwelling, and in the same manner those who after the death of King Clothar are found guilty of having first sworn allegiance to Lord Sigebert, and then have passed to the other side, shall be removed likewise. Also, whatever the kings mentioned have given to churches or their followers, or in future by God's favor wish to give in accordance with justice, shall be held securely. And whatever is due to any one of their men in either kingdom, according to law and justice, he shall not suffer any prejudice, but shall be permitted to take and hold what is due him. And if anything is taken from any one without fault on his part in an interregnum, a hearing shall be held, and it shall be restored. And as regards that which each owned through the generosity of previous kings down to the death of Lord King Clothar of glorious memory, let him keep it in security. And whatever has been taken since that from persons who are faithful, let them receive it back at once. And since a pure and untainted friendship has been formed in God's name between the kings mentioned, it is agreed that passage shall at no time be denied in either kingdom to the men of either king who wish to travel on public or private business. It is likewise agreed that neither shall entice away the others ludus or receive them when they come. And if perhaps one thinks that because of some act he has to flee to the other part, let him be excused in regard to the nature of the fault and sent back. It has been decided also to add this to the agreement, that if either party shall at any time transgress the present statute under some clever interpretation, he shall lose all the benefits, both prospective and present, and it shall turn to the advantage of him who faithfully observes all that is written above, and he shall be freed in all details from the obligation of his oath. All these matters having been definitely agreed upon, The parties swear by the name of all-powerful God and the inseparable Trinity and all that is divine, and the awful day of judgment, that they will faithfully observe all that is written above without any fraud or deceit. This compact was made 4 days before the calends of December, in the 26th year of the reign of the Lord King Guthrum, and in the 12th year of Lord Chilperic. When the agreement was read over, the king said, "May I be struck by the judgment of God if I transgress in any one of the matters contained here." And he turned to the legate Felix, who had come with us, and said, "Tell me, Felix, have you established a close friendship between my sister Brunhilda and Fredegunda, the enemy of God and man?" When he replied, "No," I said, "Let the king be sure that the friendship is being kept up between them as it was started many years ago, for you may be certain that the hatred that was once established between them is alive yet. It has not withered up. I wish you, most glorious king, would have less friendship for her, for as we often learn, you receive her embassies with greater state than ours." He answered, "Let me tell you, Bishop of God, that I receive her embassies in such a way as to not lose the affection of my nephew King Childebert, for I cannot be friendly with one who has often sent to take my life." Upon this Felix said, "I suppose it has come to your greatness that Recount has sent an embassy to your nephew to ask for your niece Clodocinda, your brother's daughter, in marriage. But he was unwilling to make any promise without your advice." The king said, "It is not well for my niece to go to a place where her sister was killed. I am not at all pleased that the death of my niece Ingunda is not avenged." Felix replied, "They are very anxious to set themselves right, either by oath or on any other terms you suggest, but only give your consent for Clodocinda to be betrothed to him as he requests." The king said, "If my nephew keeps the agreements that he bound himself to in the compact, I will do his will in this matter." We promised that he would fulfill all, and Felix added, "He begs your goodness to give him help against the Lombards so that they may be driven from Italy, and the part which his father claimed when alive may return to him, and the other part be restored by your and his aid to the dominion of the emperor." The king replied, "I cannot send my army to Italy and expose the soldiers to death uselessly, for a very severe plague is now wasting Italy." And I said, "You have told your nephew to have all the bishops of his kingdom meet together, since there are many things to be decided. But it was the opinion of your glorious nephew that each metropolitan, according to the custom of the canons, should meet with his provincials, and then what went wrong in each district would be set right by order of the bishops. For what reason is there that so great a number should assemble? The faith of the Church is not attacked by any danger. No new heresy is appearing. What need will there be for so many bishops to meet together?" And he said, "There is much to be looked into that has gone wrong, both acts of incest and matters which are in discussion between us. But the most important case of all is that of God, since you must investigate why Bishop Praetextatus was slain by the sword in his church. Moreover, there ought to be an examination of those who are accused of wantonness, so that if found guilty they can be corrected by the bishop's sentence, or if they prove innocent, that the falsity of the charge can be publicly recognized." Then he gave orders for the synod to be adjourned to the calends of the 4th month. After this conversation we went to church. It was the day of the anniversary of the Lord's resurrection. After Mass he invited us to a dinner which was as abundant in dishes as rich in cheer, for the king talked always of God, building churches and helping the poor, and then he made pious jokes, and to please us he went on to say this: "I hope my nephew will keep his promises, for all I have is his. Still, if he is disturbed because I receive my nephew Clothar's legates, I'm not so mad, am I, but that I can mediate between them and keep the trouble from going further? I know it is better to cut it short than to carry it too far. If I decide that Clothar is my nephew, I will give him 2 or 3 cities in some part, so that he shall not seem to be disinherited, and what I leave to Childebert will not then disquiet him." After this talk he bade us go on our way, treating us affectionately and loading us with gifts, and telling us always to give King Childebert good advice to live by. 21. The king himself, as we have often said, was great in almsgiving and unwearied in watches and fasting. It was told at the time that Marseille was suffering greatly from the bubonic plague, and that the disease had spread swiftly as far as the village in the country of Lyon called Octavus. But the king, like a good bishop, was for providing remedies by which the wounds of the sinful people could be cured, and ordered all to assemble at the church and engage devoutly in prayer. He directed that nothing else than barley bread and clean water should be taken in the way of food, and that all without intermission should keep watch. And this was done, and for 3 days he gave alms with more than usual generosity. And he showed such fear for all the people that he was now believed to be not merely a king, but a bishop of God, placing all his hope in God's mercy, and in the purity of his faith turning all his thoughts to him by whom he believed that these thoughts could be given effect. It was then commonly told among the faithful that a woman whose son was suffering from a 4-day fever and was lying in bed very ill, approached the king's back in the throng of people, and secretly broke off the fringe of the royal garment, and put it in water, and gave her son to drink, and at once the fever died down and he was cured. I do not regard this as doubtful, since I have myself heard persons possessed by demons in their furies call on his name and admit their ill deeds, recognizing his power. 22. Since we have told above that the city of Marseille was sick with a deadly plague, it seems suitable to give more details of what the city suffered. In these days Bishop Theodore had gone to the king to speak to him against the patrician Nicetius. But when he got no hearing from King Childebert on this matter, he made ready to return home. Meanwhile a ship from Spain put in at the port with its usual wares and unhappily brought the seed of this disease. And many citizens bought various merchandise from her, and one household in which were 8 souls was quickly left vacant, its inmates all dying of this plague. But the fire of the plague did not at once spread through all the houses, but after a definite time, like a fire in standing grain, it swept the whole city with the flame of disease. However, the bishop went to the city and shut himself within the walls of St. Victor's Church with the few who then remained with him, and there devoted himself to prayer and watching while the people of the city perished, praying for God's mercy that the deaths might at length cease and the people be allowed to rest in peace. The plague passed away in 2 months, and when the people, now reassured, had returned to the city, the disease came on again, and they who returned perished. Later on, the city was many times attacked by this death. 23. Ageric, Bishop of Verdun, dies of chagrin because Guthrum Boso, whose safety he had pledged, had been killed, and because Bertafred had been killed in his oratory. 24. Fronius, the new bishop of Vence. 25. Childebert makes war on the Lombards and suffers a defeat, the like of which in former times is not recalled. 26. Gregory assists Queen Ingeberga in making her will. 27. Duke Amallo sent his wife to another estate to attend to his interests, and fell in love with a certain freeborn girl. And when it was night, and Amallo was drunk with wine, he sent his men to seize the girl and bring her to his bed. She resisted, and they brought her by force to his house, slapping her, and she was stained by a torrent of blood that ran from her nose. And even the bed of the duke mentioned above was made bloody by the stream. And he beat her too, striking with his fists and cuffing her and beating her otherwise, and took her in his arms, but he was immediately overwhelmed with drowsiness and went to sleep. And she reached her hand over the man's head and found his sword and drew it, and like Judith Holofernes, struck the duke's head a powerful blow. He cried out, and his slaves came quickly. But when they wished to kill her, he called out, saying, "I beg you do not do it, for it was I who did wrong in attempting to violate her chastity. Let her not perish for striving to keep her honor." Saying this, he died. And while the household was assembled, weeping over him, the girl escaped from the house by God's help and went in the night to the city of Chalons, about 35 miles away. And there she entered the church of St. Marcellus and threw herself at the king's feet and told all she had endured. Then the king was merciful and not only gave her her life, but commanded that an order be given that she should be placed under his protection and should not suffer harm from any kinsman of the dead man. Moreover, we know that by God's help the girl's chastity was not in any way violated by her savage ravisher. 28. Brunhilde's messenger to the Spanish king is detained by Guthrum. 29. Childebert sends an army against the Lombards. 30. King Childebert, at the invitation of Bishop Merovius, sent assessors to Poitiers, namely Florentien, the queen's majordomo, and Romulf, count of the palace, to make new tax lists in order that the people might pay the taxes they had paid in his father's time. For many of them were dead, and the weight of the tribute came on widows and orphans and the weak. And they made an orderly examination, and released the poor and the sick, and subjected to the public tax those who should justly pay. And so they came to Tours. But when they wished to impose the payment of taxes on the people, saying they had the book in their hands, showing how they had paid in the time of previous kings, I answered, saying, It is well known that the city of Tours was assessed in the time of King Clothar, and those books were taken to the presence of the king. But the king was stricken with fear of the holy Bishop Martin, and they were burned. After King Clothar's death, this people swore allegiance to King Charibert, and he likewise swore that he would not impose new laws or customs on the people, but would thereafter maintain them in the status in which they lived in his father's reign, and he promised that he would not impose any new ordinance which would tend to despoil them. And Count Geso, in the same time, began to exact tribute, following a capitulary which we have said was written at a more ancient time. But being stopped by Bishop Euphronius, he went with the little he had collected to the king's presence, and pointed to the capitulary in which the tributes were contained. But the king uttered a groan, and fearing the power of St. Martin, he had it burned, and sent back the gold coins that had been collected to the church of St. Martin, asserting that no one of the people of Tours should pay tribute. After his death, King Sigebert ruled this city, and did not lay upon it the weight of any tribute. Moreover, in the 14 years of his reign, from his father's death up to now, Childebert has demanded nothing, and this city has not groaned with the burden of tribute. It is now for your decision whether to assess tribute or not, but be careful lest you do some harm if you plan to go against his oath. When I had said this, they answered, Behold, we have the book in our hands in which a tax was imposed on this people. But I said, This book was not brought from the king's treasury, and it has had no authority for many years. It is no wonder, considering the enmities among these citizens, if it has been kept in someone's house. God will give judgment on those who have brought out this book after so long a time to despoil our citizens. And while this was going on, the son of Audinus, who had brought out the book, was seized with a fever on the very day and died 3 days after. We then sent messengers to the king, asking him to send his commands on this matter. And they at once sent a letter ordering that out of respect for St. Martin, the people of Tours should not be assessed. Upon receipt of the letter, the men who had come for this purpose returned home. 31. An expedition of King Guthrum against Septimania is defeated. 32. Misunderstanding between Childebert and Guthrum. 33. Quarrel between Ingetrude, head of the convent within St. Martin's walls, and her daughter. 34. Regunda, daughter of Chilperic, often made malicious charges against her mother, and said that she was mistress and that her mother ought to serve her, and often attacked her with abuse, and sometimes struck and slapped her. And her mother said to her, Why do you annoy me, daughter? Come, take your father's things that I have, and do as you please with them. And she went into the storeroom and opened a chest quite full of necklaces and costly jewels. For a long time she took them out one by one and handed them to her daughter, but finally said, I am tired. You put in your hand and take what you find. And she thrust in her arm and was taking things from the chest when her mother seized the lid and slammed it down on her head. And she was holding it down firmly, and the lower board was pressing against her daughter's throat so that her eyes were actually ready to pop out, when one of the maids who was within called loudly, Run, I beg you, run! My mistress is being choked to death by her mother. And those who were awaiting their coming outside rushed into the little room and saved the girl from threatening death and led her out. After that their enmity was more bitter, and there were continual quarrels and fighting between them, above all because of the adulteries Regunda was guilty of. 35. Beratrude, when dying, appointed her daughter heir, leaving certain property to the nunneries she had founded and to the cathedrals and churches of the holy confessors. But Watto, whom we mentioned in a former book, complained that his horses had been taken by her son-in-law, and he proposed to go to an estate of hers, which she had left to her daughter, and which was within the territory of Poitiers, saying, "He came from another kingdom and took my horses, and I will take his estate." Meantime he sent orders to the bailiff that he was coming, and to make everything ready for his use. The bailiff, on hearing this, gathered all the household and got ready to fight, saying, "Unless I'm killed, Watteau shall not enter my master's house." Watteau's wife heard that warlike preparations were being made against her husband, and she said to him, "Do not go there, dear husband, for you will be killed if you go, and my children and I will be miserable." And she laid hold of him and wished to detain him, and her son also said, "If you go, we will be killed together, and you will leave my mother a widow and my brothers orphans." But these words altogether failed to hold him back, and he was inflamed with madness at his son, and calling him cowardly and soft, he threw his axe and almost crushed his skull. But the son dashed it partly aside and escaped the stroke. Then they mounted their horses and went off, sending word again to the bailiff to sweep the house and spread covers on the benches. But he paid little attention to the order, and stood with his throngs of men and women before his master's door, as we have said, awaiting Watteau's coming. He came and at once entered the house and said, "Why are these benches not spread with covers and the house swept?" And he raised his hand with the dagger in it and struck the man's head, and he fell and died. Upon seeing this, the dead man's son hurled his lance from in front against Watteau and pierced the middle of his belly with the blow, and the spearhead came out his back, and he fell to the ground. And the multitude which had gathered drew near and began to stone him. Then certain of those who had come with him rushed up amid the showers of stones and covered him with a cloak, and the people were calmed. And his son, uttering mournful cries, got him upon his horse and took him back home still living. But he died soon amid the laments of his wife and sons. And so his life was unhappily ended, and his son went to the king and obtained his property. 36. Childebert sends his son Theodebert to represent him in Soissons. 37. Bishop Drac de Gisel goes insane from excessive drinking or because evil arts have been practiced on him. 38. A plot against Brunhilde and Childebert's wife. 39 through 43. The story in detail of the secession of 40 nuns from the convent of Poitiers, with documents involved in the case. 44. The weather. Here ends the 9th book. End of section 14. Recording by btuten.
Section 15 of Selections of the History of the Franks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Selections of the History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours. Translated by Ernest BREHAUT. Book 10, chapters 1 to 14. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, here begins the 10th book. Chapter 1. In the 15th year of King Hildebert, our deacon returned from Rome with relics of the saints, and related that in the 9th month of the previous year, the river Tiber so flooded the city of Rome that ancient temples were destroyed, and the storehouses of the church were overturned, and several thousand measures of wheat in them were lost. A multitude of snakes, among them a great serpent like a big log, passed down into the sea by the channel of this river, but these creatures were smothered among the rough and salty waves of the sea, and cast up on the shore. Immediately after came the plague which they call inguinaria, footnote, affecting the groin, inguen, the bubonic plague, end of footnote. It came in the middle of the 11th month, and according to what is read in the prophet Ezekiel, quote, "Begin at my sanctuary," end quote, it first of all smote the Pope Pelagius, and soon killed him. Upon his death, a great mortality among the people followed from this disease. But since the Church of God could not be without a head, all the people chose Gregory the deacon. He belonged to one of the first senatorial families, and from his youth was devoted to God, and with his own means had established 6 monasteries in Sicily, and a 7th within the Roman walls, and giving to these such an amount of land as would suffice to furnish their daily food. He sold the rest and all the furniture of his house, and distributed the money among the poor. And he, who had been used to appear in the city, arrayed in silken robes and glittering jewels, was now clad in cheap garments, and he devoted himself to the service of the Lord's altar, and was assigned as seventh Levite to aid the Pope. And such was his abstinence in food, his sleeplessness in prayer, his determination in fasting, that his stomach was weakened, and he could scarcely stand upright. He was so versed in grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, that he was believed second to none in the city. He strove earnestly to avoid this high office, for fear that a certain pride at attaining the honor might sweep him back into the worldly vanities he had rejected. And so he sent a letter to the Emperor Mauritius, whose son he had taken from the holy font, adjuring him and entreating him with many prayers never to grant his consent to the people to raise him to this place of honor. But Germanus, prefect of Rome, forestalled the messenger and had him arrested, and the letter destroyed, and himself sent to the emperor the choice which the people had made. And the emperor, on account of his friendship with the deacon, thanked God that he had found a place of honor, and sent his command to appoint him. Because of the plague, Gregory makes an address to the people of Rome to meet it by prayer. When he spoke these words, bands of clergy gathered, and he bade them sing psalms for 3 days and pray for God's mercy. Every 3 hours, choirs of singers came to the church, crying through the streets of the city, Kyrie eleison. Our deacon, who was there, said that in the space of 1 hour, while the people uttered cries of supplication to the Lord, 80 fell to the ground and died. But the bishop did not cease to urge the people not to cease from prayer. It was from Gregory, while he was still deacon, that our deacon received the relics of the saints, as we have said. And when Gregory was making ready to go to a hiding place, he was seized and brought by force to the church of the blessed Apostle Peter, and there he was consecrated to the duties of bishop and made pope of the city. Our deacon did not leave until Gregory returned from the port to become bishop, and he saw his ordination with his own eyes. Chapter 2. Grippo returned from the Emperor Maurice and reported that in the preceding year he and his companions had taken ship and landed at an African port and gone on to Carthage the Great. While they were remaining there, awaiting the orders of the prefect who was in the city as to how they were to reach the emperor's presence, one of the men belonging to Evantius, who had gone out with him, snatched an article of value from a trader's hand and took it to their lodging. The owner of the article followed him and demanded his property back. But the man put him off, and the quarrel grew greater from day to day, and one day the trader met the man on the street and took hold of his clothes and held fast, saying, "I'll never let you go until you return to my possession what you took by violence." But the other, after trying to shake him off, did not hesitate to snatch his sword and kill the fellow, and he at once returned to the lodging, but did not disclose to his comrades what had happened. Now, as I have said, the legates were Bodizegal, son of Mumolinus of Soissons, and Evantius, son of Dynamius of Arles, and this Grippo, a Frank, and they had arisen from dinner and retired to rest and sleep. But when the act of their man was reported to the ruler of the city, he gathered soldiers, and all the people put on their armor, and he sent them to their lodging. But the legates were amazed on being wakened to see what was going on, having had no expectation of it. Then the leader cried out, saying, "Lay your arms aside and come out to us, that we may peaceably learn how the homicide happened." On hearing this, they were alarmed, as they did not yet know what had happened, and they asked for a pledge so that they could go out safely without arms. The men swore that they could, but their hastiness did not allow them to keep their oath. But soon after Bodizegal went out, they killed him with a sword, and likewise Evantius. And when they lay before the door of the lodging, Grippo seized his armor and went out to them with the men he had with him, saying, "We do not know what has happened, and behold, here are the comrades of my journey who were sent to the emperor, lying slain by the sword. God will avenge our wrong, and will atone for their death by your destruction, since you butcher us in this way, when we do not harm you, but come in peace. There shall not be peace any longer between our kings and your emperor. It was for peace we came, and to bring aid to your state. Today I call God to witness that it is your crime that has caused the promised peace to be kept no longer between the princes." When Grippo had spoken these words, and more to the same effect, this Carthaginian troop dispersed, and each returned to his home. The prefect went to Grippo and attempted to calm him as to these occurrences, and arranged for his going to the presence of the emperor. He went and told the business on which he had been sent, and described the fate of his comrades. At this the emperor was greatly annoyed, and promised to avenge their death in accordance with the judgment King Childebert should give. Then Grippo received gifts from the emperor, and returned without being molested. Chapter 3. These matters were related by Grippo to King Childebert, who at once commanded his army to march into Italy, and sent 20 dukes to conquer the Lombards. I have not thought it necessary to set their names down here in order. But Duke Audowald with Wintrio set the people of Champagne on the march, and when he came to the city of Metz, which is on the way, he plundered, slew, and mistreated the inhabitants in such a manner that it might have been thought that he was leading an army against his own country. Moreover, the other dukes did the same with their phalanxes, and ravaged their own country and the people who remained behind, before they won any victory over the enemy. When they reached the Italian boundary, Audowald, with 6 dukes, invaded the right side and reached the city of Milan, and there they pitched their camp at a distance on the plain. And Duke Olo went rashly to Bellinzona, a stronghold of the city, situated on the plains called Canini, and was wounded with a dart under the nipple, and fell and died. Moreover, when they went out to plunder in order to get food, they were slain by the Lombards, who rushed upon them everywhere. There was a lake in the territory of Milan called Ceresium, footnote, Lugano, and a footnote, out of which a small but deep stream flowed. Upon the shore of this lake they heard that the Lombards were encamped. They came to it, but before they could cross the stream we have mentioned, one of the Lombards standing on the shore, armed with a coat of mail and helmet, and carrying a lance in his hand, shouted against the army of the Franks, saying, "Today it shall appear to whom the divinity will grant a victory." It may be understood that the Lombards had arranged this as a sign. Then a few crossed and fought this Lombard and slew him. And behold, the whole army of the Lombards took to flight. Our men crossed the river, but found none of them, seeing only the camp arrangements where they had their fires and pitched their tents. And when they could capture none of them, they returned to their own camp, and there the emperor's legates came to them bringing the news that an army was at hand to help them, and saying, "After 3 days we will come with it, and this shall be a sign for you. When you see the houses of this village which is on the mountain burn with fire, and the smoke rising up to heaven, be assured that we are close at hand with the army which we promised." However, they waited according to agreement 6 days, and saw none of them come. And Cadinus, with 13 dukes, entered Italy on the left, and took 5 strongholds, and exacted oaths of fealty. But dysentery affected his army severely, because the air was new to his men, and disagreed with them, and many died of it. But when the wind rose, and it rained, and the air began to freshen a little, it brought health in place of sickness. Why more? For about 3 months they wandered through Italy without accomplishing anything, or being able to take vengeance on their enemies, since they were shut up in strongholds, or to capture the king and take vengeance on him, since he was shut up within the walls of Pavia, And then the army sickened, as we have said, because of the unhealthfulness of the air, and grew weak from hunger, and prepared to return home after exacting oaths of fidelity, and subjecting to the king's rule the people of the country, which his father had held before, and from which they took captives and other booty. And returning thus, they were so starved that they sold their armor and clothing to buy food before they came to their native place. Chapter 4. Maurice caused the Carthaginians who had killed King Childebert's legates in the previous year to be bound and loaded with chains, and sent them to Childebert's presence, 12 in number, under these conditions, that if he wished to put them to death, he should have permission, or if he would allow them to be ransomed, he should receive 300 gold pieces for each, and be content, and thus he was to choose whichever he wished, that the disagreement might be more readily forgotten, and no further cause of enmity arise between them. But King Childebert refused to accept the bound men, and said, "It is uncertain in my mind whether these men you bring are the homicides or others, perhaps slaves of somebody or other, whereas our men who were killed in your country were freeborn." Grippo, in particular, who had been legate at the time with the men who were killed, was present and said, "The prefect of the city, with 2,000 or 3,000 men whom he had gathered, made an attack on us and killed my comrades, and I would have perished with them if I hadn't been able to make a brave defense. I can go to the place and identify the men. It is these that your emperor ought to punish, if, as you say, he proposes to keep peace with our master." And so the king decided to send to the emperor for the guilty men, and he bade these depart. Chapter 5. In these days Huppa, who had once been King Chilperic's constable, made an inroad into the territory of Tours, and decided to take flocks and other property as if he were taking booty. But the inhabitants had warning, and a multitude gathered and began to pursue him. He lost his plunder, and 2 of his men were killed. He escaped with nothing, and 2 other men were captured, and there was sent in fetters to King Childebert. He ordered them to be thrown into prison, and examined as to who it was by whose aid Huppa escaped from being captured by his pursuers. They answered that it was through a stratagem of the vicar Animodus, who had the power of a judge in that district. At once the king sent a letter and ordered the count of the city to send him in chains to the king's presence, and if he should attempt resistance, he was to crush him by force and even kill him, if he wished to gain the king's favor. But Animodus made no resistance, but gave sureties, and went as he was told. And finding Flavian the court official, he pleaded together with his companion, and was not found guilty. They were acquitted and ordered to return home. However, he first gave presents to the court official. Huppa a second time roused some of his people, and purposed to carry off the daughter of Badigisel, former bishop of Mans, to marry her. He made a night attack with a band of his companions on the village of Marais to fulfill his purpose, but Magnatrude, the mother of the girl and head of the household, had warning of him and his treachery. She went out against him with her slaves and repelled him by force, killing many of his men, and he did not come off without disgrace. Chapter 6. Miraculous deliverance of prisoners in a jail in Auvergne. Chapter 7. In the same city, King Childebert most piously remitted all the tribute of the churches, as well as of the monasteries, and of the clergy who were attached to a church, and of whoever were engaged in cultivating the church land. For the collectors of the tribute had suffered great losses, since in the course of long time and succeeding generations, the estates had been divided into small parts, and the tribute could be collected only with difficulty, and Childebert, by inspiration of God, directed that the trouble should be remedied, and the amount which was due to the fisc from these should not be exacted from the collectors, and that arrearage should not deprive any tiller of church land of his benefice. Chapter 8. Where the territories of Auvergne, Gévaudan, and Rouergue meet, a synod of bishops was held to hear the case against Tetradia, widow of Desiderius, from whom Count Eulalius claimed the property which she had taken with her when she fled from him. I think that I ought to relate this case in full detail, and how she left Eulalius and fled to Desiderius. Eulalius, as a young man will, had behaved in several matters in a senseless fashion, and so it came about that he was often reproached by his mother, and began to hate when he should have loved her. Now she used frequently to devote herself to prayer in the oratory of her house, and to spend the watches of the night in prayer and tears, while her servants slept, and at last she was found strangled in the hair shirt in which she prayed. And though no one knew who had done this, nevertheless her son was charged with the murder. When Cautinus, bishop of Clermont, heard of this, he excommunicated him. But when the citizens gathered with the bishop at the festival of the blessed martyr Julian, Eulalius threw himself at the feet of the bishop, complaining that he had been excommunicated without a hearing. Then the bishop permitted him to attend the service of the Mass with the others. But when the time for communion came, and Eulalius went forward to the altar, the bishop said, "Common talk among the people declares that you are a murderer. Now I do not know whether you have done this crime or not. Therefore I leave it to the judgment of God and the blessed martyr Julian. You then, if you are fit to do so as you say, approach and take a share of the Eucharist and put it in your mouth, for God will know your conscience." Eulalius received the Eucharist and had communion and departed. He had a wife, Tetradia by name, noble on her mother's side, of low rank by her father. And in his house he took the maidservants for concubines, and began to neglect his wife, and when he returned from these harlots, he would often beat her severely. Moreover, because of his many ill deeds, he contracted a number of debts, and often used his wife's jewels and gold for these. Finally, when his wife was in this hard situation, since she had lost all the honor she had in her husband's house, and he was gone to the king, Verus, this was the man's name, her husband's nephew, fell in love with her, and wished to marry her, since he had lost his wife. Verus, however, was afraid of his uncle's enmity, and sent the woman to Duke Desiderius with the intention of marrying her later on. And she took with her all her husband's substance, both in gold and silver and garments, and all she could take, together with her older son, but she left the younger son at home. Eulalius returned from his journey and learned what had happened. And when his grief was lessened, and he had taken a little rest, he rushed upon his nephew Verus, and killed him in a narrow valley of Auvergne. And Desiderius, who had lately lost his wife, heard that Verus had been killed, and married Tetradia. But Eulalius took a girl by force from the convent at Lyons, and married her. But his concubines, impelled by envy, as some say, made her insane by evil arts. A long time after, Eulalius secretly attacked and killed Emerius, cousin of this girl. In like manner he killed Socratius, brother of his half-sister, whom his father had had by a concubine. He committed also many other crimes, too many to tell. John, his son, who had gone off with his mother, ran away from Desiderius's house, and went to Auvergne. And Innocent, being now a candidate for the bishopric of Rhodes, Eulalius sent a message to him that he could recover by Innocent's aid the property that was rightfully his in the territory of the city. Innocent replied, "If I receive one of your sons to make a cleric of, and to keep to help me, I will do what you ask." Eulalius sent the boy named John, and received his property back. And Innocent received the boy, and shaved the hair of his head, and put him in the care of the archdeacon of his church. And he became so abstemious that he ate barley instead of wheat, drank water instead of wine, used an ass instead of a horse, and wore the meanest garments. And so the bishops and leading men met, as we have said, at the confines of the cities mentioned, and Titradia was represented by Agin, and Eulalius appeared to speak against her. When Eulalius asked for the things she had taken from his home when she went to Desiderius, Titradia was ordered to repay what she took fourfold, and the children that she had by Desiderius were declared illegitimate. They also directed that if she paid Eulalius what she was ordered to pay him, she would have the liberty of going to Auvergne, and of enjoying without disturbance the property which had come to her from her father. This was done. Chapter 9. Guthrum sends an expedition against the Bretons, which proves a failure. Chapter 10. In the 15th year of King Hildebert, which is the 29th of Guthrum, while King Guthrum was hunting in the Vosges forest, he found traces of the killing of a buffalo. And when he harshly demanded of the keeper of the forest who had dared to do this in the king's forest, the keeper named Hundo, the king's chamberlain. Upon this he ordered Hundo to be arrested and taken to Chalons, loaded with chains. And when the two were confronted with each other in the king's presence, and Hundo said that he had never presumed to do what he was charged with, the king ordered a trial by battle. Then the chamberlain offered his nephew to engage in the fight in his place, and both appeared on the field. The youth hurled his lance at the keeper of the forest, and pierced his foot, and he presently fell on his back. The youth then drew the sword which hung from his belt, but while he sought to cut his fallen adversary's throat, he himself received a dagger thrust in the belly. Both fell dead. Seeing this, Hundo started to run to St. Marcellus' church, but the king shouted to seize him before he touched the sacred threshold, and he was caught and tied to a stake and stoned. After this, the king was very penitent at having shown himself so headlong in anger as to kill hastily for a trifling guilt a man who was faithful and useful to him. Chapter 11. King Clothar is dangerously ill. Chapter 12. Ingetrude, abbess of a convent attached to St. Martin's Church, dies directing that her disobedient daughter should not even be allowed to pray at her tomb. Chapter 13. One of Gregory's priests is, quote, infected with the malignant poison of the Sadducean heresy, end quote. Footnote, denying the resurrection of the body, end of footnote. He is overcome in argument by Gregory. Chapter 14. Story of the drunken priest Theodulf, who falls off the wall of Angers and is killed. End of section 15. Section 16 of Selections of the History of the Franks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Selections of the History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours, translated by Ernest BREHAUT. Book 10, chapters 15 to 31. Chapter 15. The scandal which by the help of the devil had arisen in the monastery at Poitiers was growing worse every day, and Crodilde, footnote, daughter of King Charibert, she had seceded from the monastery with a large following of nuns, and was at this time at St. Hilary's church at Poitiers, end of footnote, was sitting all prepared for strife, having gathered to herself, as I have said above, murderers, sorcerers, adulterers, runaway slaves, and men guilty of all other crimes. And so she gave orders to them to break into the monastery at night and drag the abbess from it. But the latter heard the uproar coming, and asked to be carried to the chest containing the relics of the Holy Cross. Footnote, the monastery was called the Monastery of the Holy Cross. End of footnote. For she was painfully troubled with gout, thinking that she would be kept safe by their aid. Accordingly, when the men had entered and lit the candles, and were hurrying with weapons ready here and there through the monastery looking for her, they went into the oratory and found her lying on the ground before the chest of the Holy Cross. Thereupon, one who was fiercer than the rest, having come on purpose to commit this crime, namely to cleave the abbess in two with a sword, was given a knife stab by another, the divine providence aiding in this, I suppose. The blood gushed out, and he fell to the ground without fulfilling the vow he had foolishly made. Meanwhile, Justina, footnote, Gregory's niece, the prioress, and the other sisters had taken the cloth of the altar which was before the Lord's cross, and covered the abbess with it, putting the lights out at the same time. But the men came with drawn swords and spears, and tore the nuns' clothes, and almost crushed their hands, and seized the prioress instead of the abbess, since it was dark, and pulled her robes off, and tore her hair down, and dragged her out, and carried her off to place her under guard at St. Hilary's church. But as the dawn was coming on, they perceived when near the church that it was not the abbess, and presently they told the woman to return to the monastery. They returned too, and seized the abbess and dragged her away, and confined her near St. Hilary's church, in a place where Basina lodged, footnote, one of Crodil's faction, daughter of King Chilperic, setting guards at the door, so that no one should give aid to the captive. At the next twilight they entered the monastery, and when they found no candles to light, they took a cask from the storehouse, which had been pitched and left to dry, and set fire to it, and there was a great light while it burned, and they made plunder of all the furniture in the monastery, leaving only what they were unable to carry off. This happened 7 days before Easter, and as the bishop was distressed at all this, and could not calm the strife of the devil, he sent to Crodil, saying, "Let the abbess go, so that she shall not be kept in prison during these days. Otherwise I will not celebrate the Lord's Easter festival, nor shall any catechumen receive baptism in the city, unless you order the abbess to be set free from the confinement in which she is held. And if you refuse to let her go, I will call the citizens together and rescue her." When he said this, Crodil appointed assassins, saying, "If anyone tries to carry her off by violence, give her a thrust with the sword at once." Now Flavian came in those days. He had lately been appointed domesticus, and by his aid the abbess entered St. Hilary's church and was free. Meantime, murders were being committed at the holy Radigunda's tomb. Footnote, daughter of Berthar, a Thuringian king, and the wife of Clothar I. End of footnote. And certain persons were hacked to death in a disturbance before the very chest that contained the relics of the Holy Cross. And since this madness increased daily because of Crodil's pride, and continual murders and other deeds of violence, such as I have mentioned above, were being done by her faction, and she had become so swollen up with boastfulness that she looked down with lofty contempt upon her own cousin Basina, the latter began to repent and say, "I have done wrong in supporting haughty Crodil. Behold, I am an object of contempt to her, and I am made to appear a rebel against my abbess." She changed her course, and humbled herself before the abbess, and asked for peace with her, and they were equally of one thought and purpose. Then, when the outrages broke out again, the men who were with the abbess, while resisting an attack which Crodil's followers had made, wounded one of Basina's men, who fell dead. But the abbess's men took refuge behind the abbess in the church of the confessor, and on this account Basina left the abbess and departed. But the men fled a second time, and the abbess and Basina entered again into friendly relations as before. Afterward many feuds arose between these factions, and who could ever set forth in words such wounds such killings and such wrongdoings, where scarcely a day passed without a murder, or an hour without a quarrel, or a moment without tears. King Childebert heard of this, and sent an embassy to King Guthrum to propose that bishops of both kingdoms should meet and punish these actions in accordance with the canons. And King Childebert ordered my humble self to sit on this case, together with Abergisel of Cologne, and Merovius himself, Bishop of Poitiers. And King Guthrum sent Gundigisel of Bordeaux with his provincials, since he was the metropolitan of this city. But I began to object, saying, I will not go to this place unless the rebellion which has arisen because of Chrodild is forcibly put down by the judge. For this reason a command was sent to Macco, who was then count, in which he was ordered to put the rebellion down by force if they should resist. Chrodild heard of this and ordered her assassins to stand armed before the door of the oratory, thinking they would fight against the judge, and if he wished to use force, they would resist with equal force. So it was necessary for this count to go there with armed men, and to beat some with clubs, and pierce others with spears, and when they resisted fiercely, he had to attack and overwhelm them with the sword. When Chrodild saw this, she took the Lord's cross, the miraculous power of which she had before despised, and came out to meet them, saying, Do no violence to me, I beg of you, for I am a queen, daughter of one king, and cousin of another. Don't do it, lest the time may come for me to take vengeance on you. But the throng paid little heed to what she said, but rushed, as I have said, upon those who were resisting, and bound them, and dragged them from the monastery, and tied them to stakes, and beat them fiercely, and cut off the hair of some, the hands of others, and in a good many cases the ears and nose, and the rebellion was crushed, and there was peace. Then the bishops who were present sat on the tribunal of the church, and Chrodild appeared, and gave vent to much abuse of the abbess, and many charges, asserting that she had a man in the monastery who wore woman's clothes, and was treated as a woman, although he had been very clearly shown to be a man, and that he was in constant attendance on the abbess herself. And she pointed her finger at him, and said, There he is himself. And when this man had taken the stand before all in woman's clothes, as I have stated, he said that he was impotent, and therefore had put these clothes on. But he did not know the abbess except by name, and he asserted that he had never seen her or spoken with her, as he lived more than 40 miles from the city of Poitiers. Then, as she had not proved the abbess guilty of this crime, she added, What holiness is there in this abbess, who makes men eunuchs, and orders them to live with her as if she were an empress? The abbess, being questioned, replied that she knew nothing of this matter. Meantime, when Chrodild had given the name of the man who was a eunuch, Rioval, the chief physician, appeared and said, This man, when he was a child, was diseased in the thigh, and was so ill that his life was despaired of. His mother went to the holy Radegunda to request that he should have some attention, but she called me and bade me give what assistance I could. Then I castrated him in the way I had once seen physicians do in Constantinople, and restored the boy in good health to his sorrowing mother. I am sure the abbess knows nothing of this matter. Now when Chrodild had failed to prove the abbess guilty of this charge also, she began fiercely to make others. But I have decided that it is better to insert the charges and the rebuttals of each in my narrative just as they are contained in the decision which was given as regards these same persons. Chapter 16. Copy of the Decision. To the most glorious kings, the bishops who are present send greetings. By God's favor, religion properly discloses her causes to the pious and orthodox kings who are given to the people and to whom the country is granted, knowing well that through the mediation of the Holy Spirit she is made a partner in the decree of the rulers and is supported by it. And whereas, in accordance with the command of your majesties, we are assembled at Poitiers on account of the situation in the monastery of Radegunda of holy memory, in order to take cognizance at first hand of the disputes between the abbess of the said monastery and the nuns who left the flock for no sound reason, we summoned the parties and interrogated Crodilt and Bazina as to why they had so boldly departed contrary to the rule, breaking the doors of the monastery, and why the united congregation had at this time been broken in two. In answer, they asserted that they could not endure any longer the risk of starvation, nakedness, and above all of beating, and they added also that several men had bathed in their bath contrary to decency, and that the abbess played games, and that worldly persons dined with her, and that a betrothal had actually taken place in the monastery, that she had impiously made a dress for her niece out of a silk altar cloth, and that she had frivolously taken the golden leaves which were on the border of the altar cloth, and sinfully hung them about her niece's neck, and she had made a fillet with gold ornaments for her niece, without any need for it, and that she had a masquerade in the monastery. We asked the abbess what she had to answer to this, and she said that, as to the complaint about starvation, they had never endured too great privation, considering the poverty of the time. And as to clothes, she said that if one were to examine their boxes, he would find that they had more than necessary. And as to the charge about the bath, she related that the bath had been built in the time of Lent, and that on account of the disagreeable smell of the limestone, in order that the newness of the building might not do harm to the bathers, Lady Radegunda had given orders for the servants of the monastery to use it as a common thing until all harmful odor had disappeared. It had been in common use by the servants through Lent and until Pentecost. To this Crodilt answered, and later on in the same way many men bathed at different times. The abbess replied that she did not approve of what they reported, but she did not know whether it was true. Moreover, she found fault with them for not informing the abbess if they had seen it. As to the games she played, she answered that she had played when Lady Radegunda was alive, and it was not regarded as a sin, and she said that neither in the rule nor the canons was there any reference in writing to their prohibition. However, at the order of the bishops, she promised that she would bow her head and do whatever penance should be demanded. As to the dinners, she said that she had introduced no new custom, but had merely offered the blessed bread to Orthodox Christians as had been done under Lady Radegunda, and it could not be proved against her that she had ever dined with them. As to the betrothal, she said that she had received the earnest money in behalf of her niece, an orphan girl, in the presence of the bishop, the clergy, and the leading men, and if this was a sin, she would ask for pardon in the presence of all. However, not even on that occasion had she made a feast in the monastery. In answer to the charge about the altar cloth, she brought forward a nun of noble family, who had given her as a gift a silk robe she had received from her relatives, and she had cut off a part of this to do what she wished with it, and from the rest, which was sufficient, she had made a suitable cloth to adorn the altar, and she used the scraps left over from the altar cloth to trim her niece's tunic with purple, and she said she gave this to her niece when she was serving in the monastery. All this was confirmed by Didymia, who had given the robe. As to the leaves of gold and the fillet adorned with gold, she offered Mako, your servant, who is here, as a witness, since it was by his hand that she received 20 pieces of gold from the betrothed of the said girl her niece, from which she had purchased these articles openly, and the property of the monastery was not involved in it at all. Crodilt and Bazina were asked whether perchance they imputed adultery to the abbess, which God forbid, or whether they could say she had committed a murder or a sorcery or a capital crime for which she should be punished. They replied that they had nothing to say to this. They only asserted that she had acted contrary to the rule in the matters they had mentioned. Finally, they said that nuns whom we believed to be innocent were with child because of these faults, namely, that the doors were broken open, and the wretched women were at liberty to do what they would for many months without discipline from their abbess. When we had discussed these charges in order, and had found no wrongdoing for which to degrade the abbess, we gave her a fatherly admonition for the pardonable faults she had committed, and urged her not to incur any reproof later. Then we inquired into the case of the opposing party, who had committed greater crimes, that is to say, who, when within the monastery, had despised the warning of their bishop not to go forth in despite of their bishop, and had left him in the monastery under the greatest contempt, and had broken the bars and doors and foolishly departed, involving other nuns in their sin. Moreover, when the Archbishop Gondigisil with his provincials had received notice of this case, and come to Poitiers by order of the king, and had summoned them to a hearing at the monastery, they disregarded his summons, and when the bishop went to them at the church of St. Hilary the Confessor, where they were staying, going to them as is seemly for anxious pastors to do. While they were receiving the admonition of the bishops, a disturbance arose, and they attacked the bishops and their attendants with clubs, and even shed the blood of deacons within the church. Then, when the venerable priest Teuthar, by command of the princes, came to judge this case, and the time for rendering the judgment had been fixed, they did not wait for it, but attacked the monastery like rebels, setting fire to casks in the courtyard, and breaking the doors with crowbars and axes, and setting fire, and beating and wounding nuns in the very oratories within the walls, and plundering the monastery, and stripping the clothes off the abbess, and tearing her hair, and dragging her violently through the streets in derision, and thrusting her into a place where, although not in fetters, she was not free. And when the festival of Easter came, which is always honored, the bishop offered a ransom for the prisoner, so that she could aid in baptism, but his entreaty could not secure this for any consideration. Crowdild answered that she had neither known of such a crime nor ordered it, adding further that it was at a sign from her that the abbess was not killed by her people, from which we may be confident in inferring that they were becoming more cruel, and they had killed a slave of their own monastery who was fleeing to the blessed Radigunda's tomb, and instead of improving had gone deeper into crime, and later they entered the monastery and took possession of it, and at the order of the kings to produce the rebels in public, they refused to obey, and rather took up arms against the king's command, and wickedly rose with arrows and lances against the count and the people. Then, lately, when they appeared for a public hearing, they took the holy and most sacred cross secretly and wrongfully, which they were later forced to restore to the church. Having taken cognizance of so many capital crimes, and of a wickedness that was not restrained but continually increased, we told them that they should beg the abbess for pardon for their sin, and restore what they had wrongfully taken. But they were unwilling to do this, but talked rather of killing her, a design they admitted in public. Then we opened and read the canons, and it seemed most just that until they made a suitable repentance, they should be excommunicated, and the abbess should continue permanently in her place. This is what we suggest should be done in accordance with your command, as far as the interests of the Church are concerned, having read the canons, and having made no distinction of persons. For the rest, as to the property of the monastery, and the deeds given by the kings your kinsmen, which have been stolen, and which they say they have, but disregard our orders and fail to return, it belongs to your piety, your power, and royal authority, to compel them to be returned to their place, in order that your reward and that of the previous kings may continue forever. Do not permit them to return, or think of returning again to the place which they so impiously and sacrilegiously destroyed, lest worse may come. With the aid of the Lord, let all be wholly restored, and return to God under the Catholic kings. Let religion lose nothing. Let the decision of the fathers and the canons be maintained, and be of profit to us for worship and bring you gain. May Christ the Lord support and guide you. May he bestow on you a long reign and the blessed life. Chapter 17. After this, when the decision was made known, and they were excommunicated, and the abbess restored to the monastery, they went to King Hildebert, adding crime to crime, naming forsooth certain persons to the king, who not only lived in adultery with the abbess, but also sent messengers daily to his enemy Fredegunde. On hearing this, the king sent men to bring them in chains. But when they were examined, and no wrongdoing was found, they were let go. Chapter 18. Attempt on the life of Hildebert. Chapter 19. Bishop Aegidius is removed from office. Chapter 20. Pasina and Crodild are pardoned. Chapter 21. Wado's sons are punished. Chapter 22. Death of Hilderic. Chapter 23. In this year there was such a light shed over the earth in the night that one would think it midday. Moreover, balls of fire were frequently noticed at night speeding across the sky and lighting the world. There was doubt about Easter, for the reason that Victor wrote in his cycle that Easter came on the 15th day of the moon. But to prevent Christians from celebrating this festival at the same time of the moon as the Jews, he added, "But the Latins place it on the 22nd of the moon." For this reason, many in Gaul celebrate it on the 15th of the moon, but we celebrate it on the 22nd. We made careful inquiry, but the springs in Spain, which are filled by a divine power, were filled at our Easter. There was a great earthquake on the 18th day before the calends of the 5th month, being the 4th day of the week, early in the morning when the dawn was coming. The sun was eclipsed in the middle of the 8th month, and its light was so diminished that it scarcely gave as much light as the horns of the moon on the 5th day. There were heavy rains, loud thunders in the autumn, and the streams were very full. The bubonic plague cruelly destroyed the people of Viviers and Avignon. Chapter 24. An Armenian bishop visits Tours and tells the story of the destruction of Antioch. Chapter 25. Now in the Gauls the disease I have mentioned attacked the province of Marseille, and a great famine oppressed Angers, Nantes, and Mans. These are the beginning of sorrows, according to what the Lord says in the Gospel. There shall be pestilence and famines and earthquakes in different places, and false Christs and false prophets shall arise, and give signs and prodigies in the heavens, so as to put the elect astray, as is true at the present time. For a certain man of Bourges, as he himself told later, went into the deep woods to cut logs which he needed for a certain work, and a swarm of flies surrounded him, as a result of which he was considered crazy for 2 years, whence it may be believed that they were a wickedness sent by the devil. Then he passed through the neighboring cities, and went to the province of Arles, and there wore skins and prayed like one of the devout, and to make a fool of him, the enemy gave him the power of divination. After this, he rose from his place and left the province mentioned, in order to become more expert in wickedness, and entered the territory of Gévaudan, conducting himself as a great man and not afraid to say that he was Christ. He took with him a woman who passed as his sister, and to whom he gave the name of Mary. A multitude of people flocked to him, bringing the sick, whom he touched and restored to health. They who came to him brought him also gold and silver and garments. These he distributed among the poor to deceive them the more easily, and throwing himself on the ground, and praying with the woman I have mentioned, and rising, he would give orders to bystanders to worship him in turn. He foretold the future, and announced that disease would come to some, to others losses, and to others health. But all this he did by some arts and trickeries of the devil. A great multitude of people was led astray by him, not only the common folk, but bishops of the church. More than 3,000 people followed him. Meanwhile, he began to spoil and plunder those he met on the road. The booty, however, he gave to those who had nothing. He threatened with death bishops and citizens, because they disdained to worship him. He entered La Velay, and went to the place called Puy, and halted with all his host at the churches near there, marshalling his line of battle to make war on Aurelius, who was then bishop, and sending messengers forward, naked men who danced and played and announced his coming. The bishop was amazed at this, and sent strong men to ask what his doings meant. One of these, the leader, bent down as if to embrace his knees and check his passage, and the impostor ordered him to be seized and spoiled. But the other at once drew his sword and cut him into bits, and that Christ, who ought rather to be named Antichrist, fell dead, and all who were with him dispersed. Mary was tortured, and revealed all his impostures and deceits. But the men whom he had excited to a belief in him by the trickery of the devil never returned to their sound senses, but they always said that this man was Christ in a sense, and that Mary had a share in his divine nature. Moreover, through all the Gauls many appeared who attracted poor women to themselves by trickery, and influenced them to rave and declare their leaders holy, and they made a great show before the people. I have seen some of them, and have rebuked them and endeavored to recall them from error. Chapter 26. A Syrian trader, Eusebius, becomes Bishop of Paris. Chapter 27. Among the Franks of Tournai, a great feud arose, because the son of one often angrily rebuked the son of another who had married his sister for leaving his wife and visiting a prostitute. And when reform on the part of the guilty man did not follow, the anger of the youth became so great that he rushed upon his brother-in-law and killed him and his men, and was himself killed by his opponents, and there was only one left from both parties who lacked a slayer. Upon this the kinsmen on both sides raged at one another, but were frequently urged by Queen Fredegunda to give up their enmity and become friends, lest their persistence in the quarrel might cause a greater disturbance. But when she failed to reconcile them with gentle words, she tamed them on both sides with the axe. For she invited many to a feast, and caused these three to sit on the same bench, and when the dinner had been prolonged until night covered the earth, the table was taken away according to the custom of the Franks, and they sat on the bench in their places. Much wine had been drunk, and they were so overcome by it that the slaves were intoxicated, and were lying asleep in the corners of the house, each where he fell. Then, by the woman's orders, 3 men with axes stood behind these 3, and while they were talking together, the hands of the men flashed in a single blow, so to speak, and they were struck down, and the banquet ended. Their names were Harivald, Leodovald, and Walden. When this was told to their kinsmen, they began to watch Fredegunda closely, and sent messengers to King Hildebert to seize her and put her to death. The people of Champagne were angry because of this matter, but while Hildebert was interposing delay, she was saved by the help of her people and hastened to another place. Chapter 28, Baptism of Clothar. Chapter 29, Miracles of the Abbot Aridius. Chapter 30, The Plague. Chapter 31, The Bishops of Tours from the beginning to Gregory. The 19th was I, unworthy Gregory, who found the church of Tours, in which the blessed Martin and the other bishops of the Lord were consecrated in the pontifical office, shattered and ruined by fire. I rebuilt it larger and higher, and dedicated it in the 17th year after being ordained, and in it, as I learned from the old priests, the relics of the blessed Maurice and his companions had been placed by the ancients. I found the very box in the treasury of the church of St. Martin, and in it the relics, greatly decayed, which had been brought because of their miraculous power. And while vigils were being kept in their honor, I wished to visit them again by the light of a torch, and I was examining them intently when the keeper of the church said to me, "Here is a stone with a cover, but I don't know what it has in it, and I haven't been able to learn from my predecessors who have had charge here. Let me bring it, and you look carefully to see what it contains." I took it and opened it, of course, and found a silver box containing relics of the witnesses of the Blessed Legion, as well as of many saints, both martyrs and confessors. We also found other stones hollow like this one, containing relics of the holy apostles and the rest of the martyrs. I wondered at this bounty divinely given, and after giving thanks, keeping vigil, and saying Mass, I placed them in the cathedral. I placed the relics of the holy martyrs Cosmas and Damian in St. Martin's cell close to the cathedral. I found the walls of the holy church consumed by fire, and ordered skillful workmen to repaint and adorn them with their former splendor. I had a baptistry built close by the church, where I placed the relics of the holy martyrs John and Sergius, and in what had been the baptistry I placed the relics of the martyr Benignius. And in many localities in the territory of Tours I dedicated churches and oratories, and glorified them with relics of the saints, but I think it tiresome to speak of them in order. I wrote 10 books of histories, 7 of miracles, 1 on the lives of the fathers, a commentary in 1 book on Psalms, 1 book also on the services of the church. And though I have written these books in a style somewhat rude, I nevertheless conjure you all, God's bishops, who are destined to rule the lowly church of Tours after me, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and the judgment day, feared by the guilty, if you will not be condemned with the devil and depart in confusion from the judgment, never cause these books to be destroyed or rewritten, selecting some passages and omitting others, but let them all continue in your time complete and undiminished, as they were left by us. And Bishop of God, whoever you may be, if our Marcianus has trained you in the 7 disciplines, that is, if he has taught you by means of grammar to read, by dialectic to apprehend the arguments in disputes, by rhetoric to recognize the different meters, by geometry to comprehend the measurement of the earth and of lines, by astrology to contemplate the paths of the heavenly bodies, by arithmetic to understand the parts of numbers, by harmony to fit the modulated voice to the sweet accents of the verse. If in all this you are practiced, so that my style will seem rude, even so, I beg of you, do not efface what I have written. But if anything in these books pleases you, I do not forbid your writing it in verse, provided my work is left safe. I am finishing this work in the 21st year after my ordination. Although in what I have just written of the bishops of Tours, I have told their years, still, this calculation does not agree with the total number of years, because I have not been able to learn accurately the length of time between the different ordinations. Now, the grand total of years of the world is as follows. From the beginning to the flood, 2,242 years. From the flood to the crossing of the Red Sea by the children of Israel, 1,404 years. From the crossing of this sea to the resurrection of the Lord, 1,538 years. From the resurrection of the Lord to the death of Saint Martin, 412 years. From the death of Saint Martin to the year mentioned above, namely the 21st year after my ordination, which is also the 5th of Gregory Pope of Rome, the 31st of King Guthrum, and the 19th of Hildebert II, 197 years, the grand total of which is 5,792 years. Here ends, in Christ's name, the 10th book of the Histories. End of section 16.
Section 17 of Selections of the History of the Franks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by btuten. Selections of the History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours, translated by Ernest BREHAUT. Selections from the 8 Books of Miracles. Selections from the 8 Books of Miracles. Attitude towards secular learning. Preface, book in honor of the martyrs. The priest Jerome, next to the Apostle Paul, the best teacher of the Church, tells us that he was brought before the judgment seat of the eternal judge and subjected to torture and severely punished because he was in the habit of reading Cicero's clevernesses and Virgil's lies, and that he said in the presence of the holy angels and the very ruler of all that he would never thereafter read these, but would occupy himself in future only with such writings as would be judged worthy of God and suited to the edification of the Church. Moreover, the Apostle Paul says, "Let us follow after things which make for peace, and things whereby we may edify one another." And elsewhere, "Let no corrupt speech proceed out of your mouth, but such as is good for edifying, that it may give grace to them that hear." Therefore we ought to follow after, to write, and to speak the things that edify the Church of God, and by holy instruction bring weak minds to a knowledge of the perfect faith. And we ought not to relate lying tales, nor to pursue the wisdom of philosophers that is hateful to God, lest by God's judgment we fall under sentence of eternal death. Observance of the Lord's Day. Ibid, chapter 15. In the territory of this city, Tours, at Langeais, a woman who lived there moistened flour on the Lord's Day and shaped a loaf, and drawing the coals aside, she covered it over with hot ashes to bake. When she did this, her right hand was miraculously set on fire and began to burn. She screamed and wept and hastened to the village church, in which relics of the Blessed John are kept. And she prayed and made a vow that on this day, sacred to the divine name, she would do no work, but only pray. The next night she made a candle as tall as herself. Then she spent the whole night in prayer, holding the candle in her hand all the time, and the flame went out, and she returned home safe and sound. Relics handed down in Gregory's family. Ibid, chapter 83. I shall now describe what was brought to pass through the relics which my father carried with him in former times. When Theodebert gave orders that sons of men in Auvergne should be taken as hostages, my father, at that time lately married, wished to be protected by relics of the saints, and he asked a certain bishop kindly to give him some, thinking he would be kept safe by such protection when absent on his distant journey. Then he enclosed the holy ashes in a gold case the shape of a pea pod and placed them around his neck, but the man did not know the blessed names. He was accustomed to relate that he was saved by them from many dangers, for he bore witness that by their miraculous power he had often escaped attacks of highwaymen and dangers on rivers and the furies of civil war and thrusts of the sword. And I shall not fail to tell what I saw of these with my own eyes. After my father's death, my mother always wore these precious things on her person. Now the grain harvest had come, and great grain stacks were gathered at the threshing places. And in those days, when the threshing was going on, a cold spell came on, and seeing that Les Mines has no forests, being all covered with crops, the threshers made themselves fire of straw, since there was nothing else to make a fire of. Meanwhile all went away to eat. And behold, the fire gradually increased, and began to spread slowly, straw by straw. Then the piles suddenly caught, with the south wind blowing. It was a great conflagration, and there began a shouting of men, and shrieking of women, and crying of children. Now this was happening on our own land. My mother, who wore these relics hanging on her neck, learned this, and sprang from the table, and lifted up the holy relics against the masses of flame. And all the fire went out in a moment, so that scarcely a spark of fire could be found among the burnt piles of straw, and it did no harm to the grain which it had just caught. Many years later I received these relics from my mother. And when we were going from Burgundy to Auvergne, a great storm came upon us, and the sky flashed with many lightnings and roared with heavy crashes of thunder. Then I drew the blessed relics from my bosom and raised my hand against the cloud. It immediately divided into two parts, and passed on the right and left, and did no harm to us or anyone else thereafter. But being a young man of ardent temperament, I began to be puffed up with vainglory, and to think silently that this had been granted not so much to the merits of the saints as to me personally, and I openly boasted to my comrades on the journey that I had merited by my blamelessness what God had bestowed. At once my horse suddenly shied beneath me and dashed me to the ground, and I was so severely shaken up by the fall I could hardly get up. I perceived that this had come of vanity, and it was enough to put me on guard thenceforth against being moved by the spur of vainglory. For whenever it happened after that I had the merit to behold any of the miracles of the saints, I loudly proclaimed that they were wrought by God's gift through faith in the saints. Comparative merit of Gregory and his mother. Ibid, chapter 85. On this matter I recall what I heard told in my youth. It was the day of the suffering of the great martyr Polycarp, and his festival was being observed at Riom, a village of Auvergne. The reading of the martyrdom had been finished, and the other readings which the priestly canon requires, and the time came for offering the sacrifice. The deacon, having received the tower in which the mystery of the Lord's body was contained, started with it to the door, and when he entered the church to place it on the altar, it slipped from his hand and floated along in the air, and thus came to the altar, and the deacon was never able to lay hands on it. And I believe this happened for no other reason than that he was defiled in his conscience, for it was often told that he had committed adultery. It was granted only to one priest and 3 women, of whom my mother was one, to see this. The rest did not see it. I was present, I confess, at this festival at the time, but I had not the merit to see this miracle. A fly might be a demon. Ibid, chapter 103. Panicius, a priest of Poitou, when sitting at dinner with some friends he had invited, asked for a drink. When it was served, a very troublesome fly kept flying about the cup and trying to soil it. The priest waved it off with his hand a number of times, but it would go off a little and then try to get back, and he perceived that it was a crafty device of the enemy. He changed the cup to his left hand and made a cross with his right. Then he divided the liquor in the cup into 4 parts and lifted it up high and poured it on the ground, for it was very plain that it was a device of the enemy. Miracles in Gregory's family. Book of the Miracles of St. Julian, chapter 23 and 24. At that time my father's brother Gallus was bishop of Auvergne, and I do not think I should fail to tell how he was aided in his youth by a miracle of the saint. Now I have often described the ruin King Theodoric brought upon Auvergne, when none of their property was left to either old or young, except the bare land which the barbarians were unable to carry off. In those days, then, my uncle of glorious memory, who afterwards, as I have told, governed the church of Auvergne in the high office of bishop, was a ward, and his property was so plundered by the soldiers that there was nothing at all left that was available, and he himself used often to go on foot with only one attendant to the village of BREHAUT. It happened once, when he was trudging along on this journey, that he took his shoes off on account of the heat, and as he walked in his bare feet, he stepped on a sharp thorn. This by chance had been cut, but was still lying on the ground, and was concealed point upward in the green grass. It entered his foot and went clear through, and then broke off, and could not be drawn out. The blood ran in streams, and as he could not walk, he begged the blessed martyr's aid, and after the pain had grown a little less, he went on his way limping. But the third night the wound began to gather, and there was great pain. Then he turned to the source from which he had already obtained help, and threw himself down before the glorious tomb. When the watch was finished, he returned to bed and was overcome by sleep while awaiting the miraculous help of the martyr. On arising later, he felt no pain, and examining his foot, he could not see the thorn which had entered it, and he perceived it had been drawn from his foot. He looked carefully for it, and found it in his bed, and saw with wonder how it had come out. When bishop, he used to exhibit the place where a great hollow was still to be seen, and to testify that this had been a miracle of the blessed martyr. A long time after, when the festival of the blessed martyr came, my father with all his household made haste to attend the joyful celebration. As we were on the way, my older brother Peter was seized by a fever, and became so ill that he could not move about or take food. We journeyed on in great grief, and it was doubtful whether he would recover or die. In this state of distress we at length arrived. We entered the church and worshipped at the holy martyr's tomb. The sick boy cast himself down on the pavement, praying for a cure by the glorious martyr. Finishing his prayer, he returned to his lodging, and the fever went down a little. When night came, we hastened to keep watch, and he asked to be carried along, and lying before the tomb, he begged the martyr's favor all night long. When the watch was over, he asked them to gather dust from the blessed tomb, and give it to him in a drink, and hang it about his neck. This was done, and the heat of the fever went down, so that on the very same day he took food without suffering, and walked about wherever his fancy took him. Gregory's Modesty. Preface, the 4 books on the miracles of St. Martin. The miracles which the Lord our God deigned to work through the blessed Martin, his bishop, when living in the body, he still deigns to confirm daily in order to strengthen the faith of believers. He who worked miracles through him when he was in the world now honors his tomb with miracles, and he who at that time sent him to save the perishing heathen now bestows through him blessings on the Christians. Therefore let no one have doubt about the miracles worked in former time, when he sees the bounty of the present wonders bestowed, when he looks upon the lame being raised up, the blind receiving sight, demons being driven out, and every other kind of disease being cured through his healing power. As for me, I will establish belief in the book written about his life by earlier writers, by relating for posterity at God's command his present-day miracles as far as I can recall them. This I would not presume to do if I had not been warned twice or thrice in a vision. I call all-powerful God to witness that I once saw in a dream at midday many who were crippled and overwhelmed by various diseases being cured in St. Martin's Church, and I saw this in the presence of my mother, who said to me, "Why are you so sluggish about writing of these things that you see?" I replied, "You know well enough that I am unskilled in letters, and that, simple and untrained as I am, I would not dare to describe such wonderful miracles. I wish Severus or Paulinus were alive, or that Fortunatus at the least were here to describe them. I have no skill for such a task, and I should be blamed if I undertook it." But she said, "Don't you know that nowadays, on account of the people's ignorance, one who speaks as you can is more clearly understood? Therefore do not hesitate or delay, for you will be guilty if you pass this over in silence." So I wished to follow her advice, and was doubly tortured with grief and fear. Grief that miracles as great as were done under our predecessors should not be recorded. Fear of undertaking so noble a task, ignorant as I am. However, led on by the hope of divine mercy, I am going to attempt the task thus urged upon me. For as I suppose, he who produced water in the desert from a dry rock and cooled the thirsty people is able to set these matters forth in my words, and it will be surely proved that he has again opened the ass's mouth if he deigns to open my lips and make known those miracles through an untaught person like me. But why should I fear my ignorance when the Lord our God and Redeemer chose not orators but fishermen, not philosophers but countrymen, to destroy the vanity of worldly wisdom? I have confidence then, thanks to your prayers, that even if my rude speech cannot adorn the page, the great bishop will give its fame by his glorious miracles. Remarkable Exercise of Virtue by St. Martin. Ibid, Book 1, Chapter 20. Since I have told 2 or 3 times how miracles were performed and dangers averted by the mere invocation of the glorious name, I shall now describe how the blessed bishop was called upon and brought help to one who was falling headlong to death. Ammonius, an officer of the Holy Church, arose from dinner somewhat under the influence of wine, and, the enemy giving him a push, he fell headlong over a lofty cliff that bordered the road. There was a drop of about 200 feet. While he was whirling about as he fell headlong and was flying down without wings, he kept crying for aid from St. Martin at every instant of his fall. Then he felt as if he were tossed from a saddle by someone, and he landed among the trees that were in the valley. And thus coming down slowly, limb by limb, he reached the ground without danger of death. However, that the plotter's undertaking might not seem to have been completely in vain, he suffered a slight injury in one foot. But he went to the glorious Master's church and prayed, and was relieved of all pain. Miracles worked on Gregory. Ibid, Book 1, Chapter 32 and 33. Having related the miracles performed for others, I shall tell what the miraculous power of this protector has done for my unworthy self. In the 160th year after that holy and praiseworthy man, the blessed Bishop Martin, was taken up to heaven, when the holy Bishop Euphronius was governing the Church of Tours in his 7th year, and in the 2nd year of the glorious King Sigebert, I became ill with malignant pimples and fever, and being unable to eat or drink, I was reduced to such a state that I lost all hope of the present life and thought of nothing but of the details of my burial. For death was constantly raging at me, eager to separate my soul from my body. Then when I was almost dead, I called on the name of the blessed champion, Martin, and made some improvement, and began slowly and painfully to prepare for my journey, for I had made my mind up that I ought to visit his venerable tomb. And my desire was so great that I did not even wish to live if I was to be delayed in going. Although I had scarcely escaped from a dangerous fever, I began to be on fire again with the fever of desire. And so, although not yet strong, I hastened to go with my people. After 2 or 3 stages, on entering the forest, I fell ill of the fever again, and was in such a serious condition that they all said I was dying. Then my friends came to me and saw I was very weak, and said, "Let us return home, and if God wishes to call you, you will die in your own home, and if you recover, you will make this journey you have vowed more easily. For it is better to return home than to die in the wilderness." On hearing this, I wept bitterly and bewailed my ill luck, and said, "I adjure you by all-powerful God, and the day of judgment which all fear, who have to make answer there, that you agree to my request. Don't give up the journey we have begun. And if I have merit to see the holy Martin's church, I shall thank God. But if not, carry my dead body there and bury it, because I am determined not to return home if I have not the merit to appear at his tomb." Then we all wept together and went on, and guarded by the glorious Master, we arrived at his church. The 3rd night after arriving at the holy church, we planned to keep watch, and did so. In the morning, when the bell for matins rang, We returned to our lodging, and going to bed we slept until nearly the 2nd hour. Then I woke up and found that all weakness and pain were gone, and I had recovered my former health, and I gladly called my usual attendant to wait on me. And I shall not forget to say that after 40 days that one was the first on which I took pleasure in drinking wine, since because of my illness I had detested it until then. Ibid, Book 2, Chapter 1. In the 2nd month after my ordination, when I was at a country place, I suffered from dysentery and high fever, and began to be so ill that I altogether despaired of living. Everything that I could eat was always vomited before it had been digested, and I loathed food, and when my stomach had no more strength as a result of no food, the fever was the only thing that gave me strength. I could in no way take anything substantial and strengthening. I had severe pain, too, that darted all through my stomach and went down into my bowels, exhausting me by its pain no less than the fever had done. And when I was in such a condition that no hope of life was left, and everything was being made ready for my death, and the physician's medicine could do nothing for one whom death had laid claim to, I was in despair, and called the chief physician, Armentarius, and said to him, "You have used every trick of your profession. You have tried the power of all your remedies, but secular means are of no avail to the perishing. There is only one thing left for me to do. I will show you a great remedy. Let them bring dust from the Holy Master's tomb, and make a potion for me from it. And if this does not cure me, every means of escape is lost." Then the deacon was sent to the tomb of the holy bishop just mentioned, and he brought the sacred dust, and put it in water, and gave me a drink of it. When I had drunk, soon all the pain was gone, and I received health from the tomb. And the benefit was so immediate that although this happened in the 3rd hour, I became quite well, and went to dinner that very day at the 6th hour. Ibid, Book 3, Preface and Chapter 1. Whenever headache comes on, or a throbbing in the temples, or a dullness of hearing, or a dimness of sight, or a pain attacks some other part, I am cured at once when I have touched the affected part on the tomb, or the curtain hanging before it, and I wonder within myself that at the very touch the pain is immediately gone. I shall place first in this book a miracle that I experienced recently. We were sitting at dinner after a fast and eating, when a fish was served. The sign of the cross of the Lord was made over it, but as we ate, a bone from this very fish stuck in my throat most painfully. It caused me great distress, for the point was fastened in my throat, and its length blocked the passage. It prevented my speaking, and kept the saliva which comes frequently from the palate from passing. On the 3rd day, when I could get rid of it neither by coughing or hawking, I resorted to my usual resource. I went to the tomb and prostrated myself on the pavement, and wept abundantly, and groaned, and begged the confessor's aid. Then I rose and touched the full length of my throat and all my head with the curtain. I was immediately cured, and before leaving the holy threshold I was rid of all uneasiness. What became of the unlucky bone I do not know. I did not cough it up, nor feel it go down into my stomach. One thing only I know, that I so quickly perceived that I was cured, that I thought that someone had put in his hand and pulled out the bone that hurt my throat. A phantom attacks a woman. Ibid, Book 3, Chapter 37. At this time, when a certain woman remained alone at the loom when the others had gone, a most frightful phantom appeared as she sat, and laid hold of the woman and began to drag her off. She screamed and wept, since she saw there was no one to help, but still tried to make a courageous resistance. After 2 or 3 hours, the other women returned and found her lying on the ground, half dead and unable to speak. Still she made signs with her hand, but they did not understand, and she continued speechless. The phantom which had appeared to her attacked so many persons in that house that they left it and went elsewhere. In 2 or 3 months' time, the woman came to the church and had the merit to recover her speech, and so she told with her own lips what she had endured. Procedure in case of a miracle. Ibid, Book 3, Chapter 45. The facts that I relate ought not to seem to anyone unworthy of belief, because the names of individuals are not mentioned in the account. The cause of it is this: when they are restored to health by the saint of God, they leave immediately, and they sometimes go so secretly that, so to speak, they are noticed by no one. And when the report has spread that a miracle has been done by the blessed bishop, I summon those who have charge of the church and inquire into what happened. But I do not always learn the names from them. I generally tell by name of those I have been able to see or examine personally. Minor miracles worked on Gregory. Ibid, Book 4, Chapter 2. At one time my tongue became uncomfortably swelled up, so that when I wished to speak it usually made me stutter, which was somewhat unseemly. I went to the saint's tomb and drew my awkward tongue along the wooden lattice. The swelling went down at once, and I became well. It was a serious swelling, and filled the cavity where the palate is. Then 3 days later, my lip began to have a painful beating in it. I went again to the tomb to get help, and when I had touched my lip to the hanging curtain, the pulsation stopped at once. And I suppose this came from an overabundance of blood. Still trusting to the saint's power, I did not try to lessen the amount of blood, and this matter caused me no further trouble. Gregory's uncle, St. Gall. The Lives of the Fathers, Chapter 6. St. Gall was a servant of God from his youth up, loving the Lord with his whole heart, and he loved what he knew to be beloved by God. His father was named Georgius, and his mother Leocadia, a descendant of Vectius Epigatus, who, as the history of Eusebius relates, was a martyr at Lyons. They belonged among the leading senators, so that no family could be found in the Gauls better born or nobler. And although Gall's father wished to ask for a certain senator's daughter for him, he took a single attendant and went to the monastery at Cournon, 6 miles from Clermont, and besought the abbot to consent to give him the tonsure. The abbot noticed the good sense and fine bearing of the youth and inquired his name, his family, and native place. He replied that he was called Gall and was a citizen of Auvergne, a son of the senator Georgius. When the abbot learned that he belonged to one of the first families, he said, "My son, what you wish is good, but you must first bring it to your father's attention, and if he gives you consent, I will do what you ask." Then the abbot sent messengers in regard to this matter to his father, asking what he wished to be done with the youth. The father was a little disappointed, but said, "He is my oldest son, and I therefore wished him to marry. But if the Lord deigns to receive him into his service, let his will rather than mine be done." And he added, "Consent to the child's request, which he had made by God's inspiration." 2. The abbot, on receiving this message, made him a clerk. He was very chaste, and as if already old, he had no wicked desires. He refrained from a young man's mirth. He had a voice wonderfully sweet and melodious. He devoted himself constantly to reading. He took pleasure in fasting and was very abstemious. When the blessed Bishop Quintian came to this monastery and heard him sing, he did not allow him to stay there any longer, but took him to the city, and like the Heavenly Father, fed him on the sweetness of the Spirit. On his father's death, when his voice was improving day by day, and he was a great favorite among the people, they reported this to King Theodoric, who at once sent for him and showed him such affection that he loved him more than his own son. He was loved by the queen with a similar love, not only for his beautiful voice, but also for his chastity. At that time King Theodoric had taken many clerks from Auvergne, whom he ordered to serve God in the church at Trèves, but he never allowed the blessed Gall to be separated from him. So it came that when the king went to Cologne, he went with him. There was there a heathen temple full of various articles of worship, where the neighboring barbarians used to make offerings and stuff themselves with food and drink until they vomited. There also they worshipped images as God, and carved limbs in wood, each one the limb in which he had suffered pain. When the holy Gall heard of this, he hastened to the place with only one clerk, when none of the benighted pagans was present, and set it on fire. And they saw the smoke of the fire rolling up to the sky, and searched for the one who had set it, and found him, and pursued him, sword in hand. He fled and took refuge in the king's court. But when the king had learned from the pagans' threats what had been done, he pacified them with agreeable words, and so calmed their furious rage. The blessed man would often weep in telling this story, and say, "Unhappy me that I did not stand my ground, and let my life be ended in this affair." He was deacon at the time. 3. Later, when the blessed Bishop Quintian passed from this world by God's command, the Holy Gaul was living in Clermont, and the people of the city assembled at the house of the priest Impatratus, Gaul's uncle on his mother's side, lamenting at the bishop's death and asking who should be appointed in his place. After long debate, they returned each to his own house. On their departure, the Holy Gaul called one of the clerks and said, the Holy Spirit rushing into him, "What are these people muttering about? Why are they running to and fro? What are they debating?" "They are wasting their time," said he. "I am going to be bishop. The Lord will deign to bestow this honor on me. Now when you hear that I am returning from the king's presence, take my predecessor's horse with the saddle on him, and come and bring him to me. If you refuse to obey me, take care you are not sorry for it later." As he said this, he was lying on his bed. The clerk was angry at him, and abused him and struck him on the side, breaking the bed at the same time, and went off in a rage. On his departure, the priest Impatratus said to the blessed Gaul, "My son, hear my advice. Don't waste a minute, but go to the king and tell him what has happened here, and if the Lord inspires him to bestow this holy office on you, I shall give thanks to God. Otherwise you can at least recommend yourself to the man who is appointed." He went and reported to the king what had happened. And the clerks of Clermont, with the choice of the foolish, went to the king with many gifts. Even then that seed of iniquity had begun to germinate, that bishoprics were sold by kings and bought by the clerks. Then they heard from the king that they were going to have St. Gall as bishop. He was ordained priest, and the king gave orders to invite the citizens to a feast at the expense of the treasury, and to make merry over the promotion of Gall, the future bishop. This was done. He was in the habit of telling that he had given no more for the office of bishop than a third of a gold piece which he had given to the cook who prepared the feast. Then the king appointed 2 bishops to accompany him to Clermont. And the clerk, Viventius by name, who had struck him on the side when he was in bed, hastened to meet the bishop according to his command, but not without great shame. And he presented himself and the horse which Gall had ordered. When they had gone into the bath together, Gall gently reproached him for the pain in his side which he had incurred from the contemptuous violence of the clerk, and he caused him great shame, not in a spirit of anger, however, but only delighting in a pious joke. After that he was received into the city with much singing, and was ordained bishop in his own church. End of section 17. Recording by btuten.